Good morning, Belize. Good morning to our friends and supporters from across the globe. Welcome, welcome, welcome to the second annual Belize Culture Symposium organized by Heritage Education Network Belize. Culture is back. Thank you for joining us this morning for this monumental symposium. I am your host for this morning, Sylvia Bate, co-director here at Heritage Education Network Belize. Before we get into the symposium, we would like to thank our media partner, Colorblind Multimedia Productions, for rebroadcasting this symposium. The second annual Culture Symposium is brought to you by Heritage Education Network Belize. And if you haven't heard of us yet, we are a newly founded, non-governmental, non-profit organization dedicated to the promotion of culture and heritage through education, capacity building, and advocacy. We are spearheaded by myself, Sylvia Bate, Miss Ella Bekeshi, Miss April Martinez, and Dr. Rebecca Friedel Juan. We are four female archaeologists and heritage professionals who, in early 2020, formed Heritage Education Network Belize as a response to the disruptions of the pandemic. I would like to now share with you all some words on behalf of the four directors of Heritage Education Network Belize. So HENB, as we call ourselves, was founded by Miss Ella Bekeshi, Miss April Martinez, Dr. Rebecca Friedel Juan, and I. Again, we are an independent, non-governmental organization. In some form or the next, us four directors have all dedicated our lives to conducting archaeological research in Belize and to creating actionable change from that research. What Heritage Education Network Belize represents is a synergy of our independent efforts. In the 2 years since we have launched our organization, HENB has grown to be a community of over 2,500 people interested in culture and heritage of Belize. Our goal is to safeguard and promote culture and heritage as a means to sustainability through education, capacity building, and advocacy. And we cannot do that without open dialogue and the support and participation of this constantly growing community. HENB is a platform that advocates for the multivocality of culture and the representation and inclusivity of all Belizeans, especially those from descendant, indigenous, and historically underrepresented communities. We advocate for agency in all decision-making processes, particularly those that affect self-actualization. HENB supports local, regional, and international efforts that affect change through the inclusivity of culture in all areas of society. And we are absolutely grateful to be able to further promote these goals through our recent nomination of the historic areas of Lamanai Archaeological Reserve to the 2022 World Monuments Fund watch list. In honor of that and the collaborations with the Heritage and Archaeological Management organizations in Belize, our day 3 of the second annual Culture Symposium is dedicated to the promotion of Lamanai and all of its diversity. The goals of the Culture Symposium overlap with our organizational mission. In the next few days, we will create a virtual space for scholars, citizen scientists, and interested persons to initiate interdisciplinary dialogue, to bridge boundaries between academia and the broader public, and to showcase the relevance of Belizean language, culture, heritage, and the arts. The intersections between this, our daily lives, and global issues. At the heart of the symposium and our organization is the diversity of our culture and the opportunity for us to pivot our experiences of culture to one of inclusivity. The knowledge that we create in this space over the next 3 days will live on longer than these days of the symposium. It will live on in accessible digital libraries for research and cultural information that is accessible to the public. These actionable steps of creating access for information related to our culture and heritage and creating spaces where Belizeans can be at the forefront of these discussions. Through this, we hope that we will encourage inclusivity in the cultural and heritage fields by involving citizen scientists and young scholars and providing a platform for the sharing of research and experiences. We hope that you will continue to join us on our journey to achieve these things, and we welcome you all to participate in the coming days or at any point in the future. Thank you all for being here. And before we begin this 3-day journey, the directors at Heritage Education Network Belize would also like to say a big thank you to all the volunteers and the presenters who are here helping to make this event possible. And to all the wonderful people, our wonderful Belizeans, who have supported us as an NGO. We are a volunteer-led organization, which means that everyone who is bringing this symposium to you, bringing this event to you, worked in their free time out of a passion and love for Belize. We do hope that you will enjoy this symposium, and we thank you for joining in. We now move on to our keynote address for this morning. Heritage Education Network Belize now presents to you Mrs. Arene Palacio Morgan. Mrs. Arene Palacio Morgan was born in Belize City. She attended the University of South Florida and the Universities of the West Indies. Ms. Arene worked within media and communication for a few years before falling in love with marine conservation. This love and passion allowed her to invest 19 years in environmental advocacy, conservation education, and outreach, having had the opportunity to work with statutory bodies, non-governmental organizations, communities, and international stakeholders. Arene is an avid volunteer, and she has served on several board of directors, including that of the University of West Indies Alumni Association, the Belize Lupus and RA Association, Living with Hope, that advocates for visibility for persons with HIV and AIDS, and the Placencia Belize Tourism Industry Association. Currently, Ms. Arene is the UNESCO Secretary General for the National Commission in Belize, committing her time to the development of culture, education, and technology. She also serves on the board of directors for the National Institute of Culture and History. We are honored to have a few remarks from Ms. Arene Palacio Morgan.
Over the moon and deeply honored to have been asked by the Heritage Education Network of Belize to deliver remarks at the opening of the second KULCHA Symposium. Brilliant ladies. As I mentioned at our first meeting, I feel your passion, I see your vision, and I'm here for it. I'm along for this journey. I'm very proud of you ladies. Pantatina now. The cause of HENB is noble, and I wish you all the best in the future. When I was first asked to speak at this symposium, a myriad of topical areas, subjects flew through my mind. Should I speak on history, archaeology, anthropology, natural or cultural heritage, or maybe weigh in on my experience being raised by two social scientists. It occurred to me that I cannot preach to the converted. I am by no means an expert on the above mentioned topics, with the exception of the latter. So I settled on that. By the way, this speech is inspired by a conversation I had with April and Sylvia about capturing the experiences of our experts who are now our elders, and also by a very close friend of mine that is currently completing PhD studies in Florida. I will share with you the ideas expressed about national identity and cultural heritage during one hotly contested debate around our family dinner table. And I frame it in the context of the poem by Philip Lewis, I Think I Say One New Belize. Let me set the stage. Picture this, the Palacio dinner table. My father, Dr. Joseph Palacio, archaeologist, anthropologist, born in Barranco, arguably the best village in Belize, is extraordinarily accomplished, an expert, pioneer, teacher, leader, author, trailblazer, and a distinguished yet humble Garifuna man. My mother, urban studies, entrepreneur, politician, social planner, historian, widely published as well, also a pioneer and trailblazer, was born in Dangriga and was raised by her great-grandmother. My brother, Aniki Palacio, Policy, International Relations, Human Resource and Labor Issues expert. And then me, of course, normally the devil's advocate and anti whatever position Joseph has taken. According to Philip Lewis, I think I say one new Belize, where the Creole, the Mestizo, the Garifuna, and the Maya not separate as I list them, but instead all the Belizean. The name of George Price is synonymous with the struggle for Belizean self-rule and eventually independence. Very few Belizeans have traveled as extensively or been photographed visiting every nook and cranny of our country by foot, horse, and his trusty Land Rover than Right Honorable George Price in pre-independence Belize. He no doubt experienced a very much divided country ethnically by geographical regions, completely circumstantial, historical, and in most cases, not conflict-driven. Garifuna in the south, Creole in the central, Mestizo in the north, and so on. Belize had quite a unique experience in cultural identity and heritage than the rest of our region, according to Joseph, and I'll explain why. Mr. Price, labor activist, statesman, almost a Jesuit priest, who learned in the Rerum Novarum, an open letter of 1891 by Pope Leo XIII that spoke to the concept of supporting the needs of others, leading to empowerment and self-sufficiency. Mr. Price had a political, economic, and more importantly, cultural vision of our post-independent nation and introduced the slogan, A New Belize, in 1981. What that meant to national development, how that was defined, was up to our own interpretation. We all had work to do, building a new identity called Belizean. With all the uncertainties aside, it actually happened, creating what my son learned in Belizean studies as the melting pot. And it continues to cook. I think I see one new Belize. This year time, that not like a before time. Remember when we couldn't see? Now we move the thing from over with eye. All with a one. According to Myrtle, 41 years ago, we were still separated. However, through the process of assimilation and acculturation, we have borrowed cultural symbols, dance, the food, etc., from each other and made them our own. Interethnic mating has resulted in offspring of multi-ethnic identities. Garifuna Ma, Quechua, East Indian Pa, Mestizo Ma. Garifuna and Creole mixing is very prevalent, and I have several examples in my family. Then again, which Belizean really doesn't? This resulting from an ease of transportation caused by the need for social institutions, movements for jobs, for school, for health reasons. We are no longer predominantly only Garifuna da South, Creole da Central, Mestizo up north. Now rice and beans and hudut are signature Belizean dishes. Punta is danced by everyone at concerts, and you've heard the Mayan parandero. In fact, the nicest pibil tacos I have ever had were made by my Asian neighbors very recently. This year, the September celebrations, Down south, Miss Toledo was a successful candidate from the traditionally 100% Garifuna Barranco village. She is of Quechua ethnicity. 30% of the students at the St. Joseph Primary School in that village are of Maya descent, with Barranco's residents now coming from Canada, the US, Guatemala, and surrounding villages. No other country regionally quite has had this experience, where a leader had this vision of national identity that is eventually, organically, without much direct effort, being achieved. A common cultural heritage is many times key to national identity, but sometimes it is the perfect blend that enhances uniqueness, pride, and forms the foundation of national identity. Either way, the preservation and safeguarding of what we defined as our cultural heritage is an essential part of protecting a sense of identity. But what is our identity? I am patiently awaiting the results of our housing and population census. For the first time, we are able to choose more than one ethnicity. What will these numbers look like, aggregated and disaggregated? The protection and enhancement of cultural heritage has been a long-term process, which can only be fully promoted if skills and knowledge are transferred across generations, such as folklore. In many instances, respect for and awareness of cultural heritage must be learned. Further to this, the idea of shared cultural heritage is also not an instinctive notion, but can be taught, learned, and understood by young people. Herein lies the future of our cultural identity, our young people. How do we educate them? What do they learn? How do we make use of technology? Where do we really go from here? And who will we be in the next 5, 10, or 15 years? What do we do now to ensure we mitigate the threats to our intangible and tangible cultural heritage? And how will these be valued by our next generation? I look forward to a public forum or intellectual conversation with experts as a part of our September celebrations on the factors that form our national identity and how cultural heritage plays a role in our national development. Who are we? Where are we? And where are we going? Heritage is people. Heritage is us, creators, the interpreters, and the users. The links between society and heritage have been identified as central in the debate on human inheritance and its preservation, according to Professor Porchula at the opening of the 41st session of the UNESCO World Heritage Committee. Cultural heritage is more than a precious resource, but a value, a currency, an economic asset, an identity factor, and it can contribute to social cohesion. It is time to define who we are and continue to live the dream of our very first Prime Minister. Is it time to accept the cultural legacy we made, which we live in the present, which we will pass on to future generations? It is our way of life. I agree with Philip Lewis's poem, Man look ya, bruh, that time to say this ya new Belize. Thank you so much. Do enjoy the symposium. I look forward to the presentations and discussions and congratulate Henby once again for your energy, your passion, and your vision. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arene, for those words, and
You're
for
welcome.
sharing, also with a story. I think that is one of the ways in which we show our Belizean culture, where when we start a conversation, a lot of times it is by creating that community and by connection and saying, man, look, yeah, make I tell you a story or two. So thank you very much for not only opening our symposium, but doing it in the most Belizean way possible. Gratitude, and we appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Good morning and welcome again. And thank you again to Ms. Ariane Palacio Morgan for opening our symposium with those wonderful words that truly embody our representations of culture and those tangible links to our heritage. It is my pleasure to kick off the first of many sessions for our symposium. We are beginning our KULCHA Symposium with our exploration of our tangible Belizean culture, with a focus on highlighting the rich heritage that Belize and its region has in this session entitled Ancient Maya Archaeology, Regional Questions. Archaeology is the exploration of humanity's past through material remains. And Belize has a long history, over 100 years, of archaeological research. We are honored to have with us today many experts in ancient Maya archaeology leading the field in new and exciting directions. These experts explore the origin of early populations to Belize, the start of new technologies, and of course, exciting research from across Belize, from north to west to south. What is clear from these diverse presentations is the vibrant and deep human history that has laid the foundation for the cultural diversity of modern-day Belize. We hope that Belizeans feel a sense of pride and respect for this history and this heritage, which continues to inspire millions across the globe. Our first presenter for this morning is Dr. Fred Valdez. Dr. Valdez, has participated in archaeological research projects in Belize for more than 40 years. He currently serves as the director of the Program for Belize Archaeology Project in northwestern Belize. His presentation, entitled The Innovative Ancient Maya, Major Developments and Adaptations, explains how some archaeological investigations provide new insight on how the Maya developed and progressed over time. From pre-classic developments such as monumental architecture, agricultural fields, and symbolism, early classic resources, adaptation, and internal relations to late to terminal classic activities. Each of these major periods allows us to contemplate how the Maya adapted or survived, and if we could do the same today. We are pleased to have Dr. Fred Valdez open our culture symposium.
I'm from the University of Texas at Austin. Thank you for being here, and it's my pleasure to present here at the second KULCHA Symposium of Belize. My topic today has to do with the ancient Maya, what I call the innovative Maya, and I'm going to be talking about some of the developments and some of the adaptations, some of their creative innovations that we still see today. I will start with some of the earliest Maya. Let me see if I can go to a shared screen here. So I'll start with a brief chronology. We have the middle Preclassic, starts at somewhere around 1200, perhaps later 1000 BC or so to about 400 BC. Late Preclassic from 400 BC to 250 CE, and early Classic 250 to 600. That's probably about as far as we'll get today in terms of talking about some of these innovative aspects for the Maya. We know that the Maya area, for example, is southern Mexico and all the way to the Caribbean coast, where Belize is represented here. I'm going to start today with a few items that are actually pre-Maya and see how we can bring those into play in particular. This other map that I'm showing now is just to show where some of the highland areas are, including this portion of southern Belize, which is also very much mountainous and so forth. But the green area represents the lowland regions, and that's more of the focus that I have today. So some of the earliest stone tools that we have once people are conducting horticultural activities include these particular kinds of what are called unifacial tools. These are known from perhaps as early as 3000 or 3400 BC up through 2000 to 1000 BC or so. And they're used for certain kinds of horticultural, agricultural activity, for deforestation, for cropping, and so forth. This is left then or inherited by the Maya. We know these people were involved in producing corn, at least an early version of corn, avocado, chili peppers that show up. But the key here is what's known as the Mesoamerican Triad or Mesoamerican Trinity, and that's corn, beans, and squash, which the Maya by 1200 or 1000 BCE are clearly producing in significant amounts, feeding lots of people, providing for permanent settlement, starting to build architecture, and we're going to move into some of these aspects as we go along. Some of those tools on the bottom left there, you see those unifacial or flat-sided tools, eventually some of them becoming bifacial and used for other kinds of activities, still significantly involved in horticulture and so forth, but used for other activities as well. Some of the earliest Maya architecture are simple platform lined buildings, supported houses and other areas. In this particular case, you can see what might have been cooking features within that particular building. And they often will have burials to the outside of them with special offerings, such as this, we call this pot-bellied censaria or incense burner. And this particular piece represents and is an example of something that represents long-distance trade, long-distance communication, a shared ideology or belief system, perhaps between quite distant regions. But that becomes another topic for another day. This is just to emphasize that these kinds of things are there. I'm going to focus on certain other aspects. One of the things that happens in this middle pre-classic period is the introduction of certain kinds of crafts and technologies, including shell bead making. These little bone, anthropomorphic bone pieces actually have a hole through them, through the head part of them, and would have been strung onto as a necklace of sorts. So we start to see the beginnings of levels of social status, perhaps as early as the middle pre-classic, and it's clearly in place by the time we get to the late pre-classic. We also have chocolate that's introduced. This is a spouted jar, also known as a chocolate pot, and it was sampled or tested for residues and shown to have chocolate. So we know that the Maya were not only had chocolate, but were using chocolate in some capacity, certainly by 1000 BC. The form of agriculture or horticulture that took place in the earliest times, even before the Maya, was clearing of the area, sort of a deforestation of sorts that already starts by 3400 or 2000 BC. We have deforestation underway. The middle pre-classic Maya certainly continue with these activities without hesitation. And this is an example of what takes place. This kind of extensive horticulture means that you're now producing a dependable food crop. You're producing a food crop yourself. You're not counting on what's available from the wild. That means you can afford and you're able to feed more people. That means you can have a larger population. A larger population means a greater labor force. That also then leads to complexity and the need to develop other kinds of social and political institutions. Here we see sort of a little bit of water along the bottom of this slide that represents a canal. These are raised fields, of course, long since abandoned. There's another version with water along the bottom side, and it goes up to this other end, and you see a raised field here in the center that would have been great for growing any kind or any number of tree crops, as well as plants, ornamental foods, and so forth. From LiDAR, we're able to access areas as we see here. This hatchered zone that this cursor is encircling there are raised fields that are hard to get to that we otherwise wouldn't know about just walking through the forest. Here's an aerial view of another area that shows what some of these remnant fields are like. This is intensive agriculture. And these fields are to take water away from the fields, not to bring water to the fields, but to take water away so that during the rainy season, they are better drained and you can get another crop in. So in the late pre-classic, the Maya have come up with this innovative, phenomenal horticultural, agricultural component known as raised fields that allow for extra crops, an extra crop per year. Now you can feed even more people. And it is during this late Preclassic, and from the middle Preclassic to late Preclassic, we know that the Maya, for example, are incredibly knowledgeable about the plants and the animals in their areas. And those plants and animals also make their way into artwork. But these different strategies, intensive agriculture, the domestic gardens, these are applied to different environments depending on what works best. So the Maya are very much aware of the geography, the geology, as well as the plants and the animals in the area. Here's an example of a cahoon palm, allspice, all of these things that would have been known, the different animals known to the Maya in the past. And these are represented in artwork as well as in the form of pottery, etc., from the past. So we know how important these were as part of Maya society. The stone tools and the pottery of the ancient Maya are also quite varied. Here's another example of a chocolate pot. This one's decorated with these incised designs, quite elaborate. We know of workshops that the Maya had, all chips of stone, phenomenal in terms of producing millions of stone tools. Here is a blade removed from this core in the center, this blade that has a little residue along the top, and that residue is human blood. Sorry, go there. And here is the cache or the special deposit that it was within. So there was a blood sacrifice that went along with this dedication of a large building. These are examples of from the earliest stone tools in the lower left to the more elaborate tools of the late Preclassic to the sort of these eccentrics and ritual tools that occur from the late Preclassic into the Classic at large. Architecture also becomes more elaborate. In the late Preclassic, we have monumental architecture, large platforms upon which timber temples were built. Some of these platforms, some of these buildings are highly decorated with incised and or painted decoration. And those timber temples are eventually replaced by masonry temples, as you see here, with these stone buildings at the top rather than a timber temple. And the reason is that the deforestation that began back at 3400 BC into 2000 BC, into the earliest Maya that continued in the late Classic, forced the quality of wood that was necessary for those timber temples, etc. They were much, much further away, much harder to get. The Maya had to come up with some way of continuing to build these structures. Now that Maya society had become so complex by the end of the late Preclassic, how do they build these temples when lumber, when wood is so hard to come by and so forth? And they are innovative enough that they invent the corbelled arch, which allows for these temple buildings of stone above the structures themselves. We have tombs that are introduced, elaborate multi-painted tombs. And from those tombs and other data, such as architecture, pottery, and obsidian, we understand that by the early Classic then, as we move out of that terminal Preclassic into the early Classic, the Maya are significantly involved with Teotihuacan in central Mexico in terms of trade, exchange, and just interactions in general terms. So this particular tomb, see this vessel here at the center, this slab-footed tripod, that's always been known as a Teotihuacan style vessel. Very important, incredibly elaborate. It just reinforces and establishes that there is this kind of communication and interaction taking place. The Maya also had elaborate textiles that we tend to see in pottery, as well as imprints on the tomb, and I'll show that here in a minute. I want to emphasize this one vessel that's over here. You see it on the floor of the tomb. It's there on the right. We'll come back to that momentarily. Here's impressions of textiles that show up on some tomb walls in the mud and plaster of those walls. Tells us a lot about the technologies and what they had available and how much they used for their rulers at the time. This particular vessel, which is called the chocolate pot, for reasons that these medallions on here, these stuccoed medallions or glyphs, indicate that this vessel was made to contain chocolate. And indeed, the residue from within that does show that that is chocolate in the early Classic, but we already know the Maya were using chocolate from way back in the middle Preclassic. We saw earlier from that spouted jar. The fascinating part technologically about this particular piece has to do with the technology of its construction. It has within the head, the handle, the lid, these nubs, these nobbins that are on the inside. And those fit into this L-shaped groove, right? This L-shaped slot on the rim of this jar. And it slides down, and then you twist the top and it locks it in place. So the Maya, although this seems like an incredibly simple and obvious kind of technology, the concept and then to put it into action is a phenomenal step forward. And then from here, the Maya become more complex in the late classic in terms of kingship and political organization. One place, the Lamanai in Belize, in northern Belize, is one of the places that survives the turbulent terminal classic and survives in its adaptations into the post-classic. An incredibly important site. Belize is at the heart of some of the most important history of the Maya, particularly late in time. This slide is a photo from our camp looking at the night sky and what the Maya must have seen in the ancient past. So when we look at the Maya of the ancient, I would say there's a phenomenal amount that they would have seen, that they would have known, and that we have yet to learn. I thank you very much. I appreciate your time, and we will see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Valdez, for that overview of Maya development and for that exploration of how it can inform our current lived experiences. Next on this morning's agenda, we have the presentation by Dr. John Spenard. Dr. Spenard is an anthropological archaeologist whose focus is on the intersections of religion, landscape, community identity, memory, politics, and worldview among the Preclassic and Classic period Maya people. In 2018, he initiated the Frio Regional Archaeological Project, RIFRAP, with permission from the Belize Institute of Archaeology and the Forestry Department. The RIFRAP project is the first long-term archaeological study of the Mountain Pine Ridge Forest Reserve in the Cayo District here in Belize. The project current focus is locating and documenting previously unrecorded sites, including cave sites, settlements, shrines, quarries, hunting camps, etc., to understand past Maya habitation and use of the mountain pine ridge. We now introduce our second presentation, just who were the ancient Maya using the Rio Frio caves.
Coming out today. My name is Dr. John Spenard, and I'm going to be talking with you about just who were the ancient Maya using the Rio Frio caves. But before I get started, I just want to thank Heritage Education Network Belize for inviting me to present here and to congratulate them on another successful Belize Culture Symposium. I'm very happy to be participating again and look forward to sharing my research with you all. So let's go ahead and get started. Rio Frio Cave is a very popular tourist destination for people visiting the Mountain Pine Ridge. With high ceilings, almost unbelievable scenery, and a road driving to it, it's easy to see why so many people visit it every year. But it's not the only cave in the vicinity. Just up the road from it, you'll see a sign for Twin Cave, also known as Rio Frio Cave A. And right across the street from that is Rio Frio Cave B, the other twin cave. And certainly there's several others in the area. So that we're all familiar with the area that we're going to be talking about today, we'll just go ahead and zoom in on Belize here. And highlighted here is the Mountain Pine Ridge Forest Reserve, where the Rio Frio Caves are. And down south is Caracol. And then we'll be talking about the Rio Frio Caves in this area. Though they are well known to tourists, surprisingly little is known about the Rio Frio Caves archaeologically. The first archaeologist to record them was Gregory Mason in 1928, who recorded caves A, B, and C, also known as Rio Frio Cave and Twin Caves. 30 years later, Archaeology Commissioner Hamilton Anderson came up to the area and he documented 2 other caves, D and E. And it wasn't until 2011 to 2016 that Dr. Holly Moyes and Dr. Jaime Awe conducted their Belize Regional Cave Project and recorded a few other caves in the general vicinity. That has been the entire history of research of the Rio Frio caves up to this point. In 2018, I began my Rio Frio Regional Archaeological Project with permission from the Belize Institute of Archaeology. Because so little is known about the caves, my primary research questions were: when were they used, what rituals were being performed there, and who was using them? And it's this last question that I hope to address. In his write-up of the caves, Mason said Cave A was an ideal home for a primitive man, as well as for his more cultivated descendants who made the pottery. The quantities of pots and potsherds indicate that it housed a large population for hundreds of years. Regarding Cave E, Pendergast notes that there are no recorded surface sites in the immediate vicinity of the Rio Frio caves. The presence of a source of potable water near the cave might have made it attractive for habitation, but the soils in the area are generally scarce. Suffice it to say that when I started my project, we didn't have a good idea of who were using the caves. And I would just like to point out this gentleman down here for a scale of the size of Rio Frio Cave E. So addressing this question of who were the ancient Maya using the Rio Frio caves, we have a few possibilities. 1, they were living in the caves. 2, they were being visited by long-distance pilgrims. Or 3, perhaps there was an unknown local population. Although Mason wrote that people were living in the caves, archaeologists have really come to conclude over the last several decades that really any cave in the Maya area is simply too inhospitable for a whole wide variety of reasons for them to have lived in them. So this really left my project with 2 possible answers to who were using the caves. Either they were long-distance pilgrims, or they were from an unknown local population. Now, when I started my project, I did hear rumors of some mounds in the area, but nothing had ever been verified, and it seemed like it was a small rural population, likely not responsible for the amount of ritual activity seen in the caves. On the other hand, the ceramics from Cave E showed very strong ties to the Belize Valley, and so it seemed that going to relocate that cave would help us address this question. Because if they were connected to the Belize Valley, then maybe it was long-distance pilgrims coming down. So we set out to go relocate Cave E because it would help us understand our research area a little bit better, and it would help us address this question of who was using the caves. So in June 2019, we set out to find it. And long story short, we did not. Many of the caves we found looked like this. Clearly not the grandiose entrances that Pendergast published about Cave E. But as we walked around the valley, we did see some signs of ancient habitation as we were told that we might expect to find, and it was seemingly very rural. We came across a few agricultural terraces and a few small mounds distributed here and there, but nothing significant. After a long day of not finding the cave and not really finding much in the way of any other ancient Maya settlement, we decided to return to our vehicle. We reached the valley floor and came across this mound. Measuring about 2 meters tall and 2 meters to each side, this is the largest mound we had seen this day, and clearly it was something significant. So as I set my things down to record it, my colleagues Mike and Javier ran off because they had seen some other mounds behind it. Just as I was preparing to take this picture, both called out to me. Following their voices, I found Javi first, standing in front of what turned out to be an 8 to 10 meter tall pyramid, and here he is climbing it. You can see him on the left at the very top. Clearly, we had found a site of some significance. Looking for my other colleague Mike, we find him here, in front of this stela, on the front side of this building that also had a looter's trench in front of it that Javi is standing on top of. So with this story of rediscovery, what I'm excited to do now is to introduce you all to the site of Nohotbatso. Now this site is located right in between caves C and E in the Rio Frio Valley, and so it seems to be pretty safe to assume that we have accidentally learned who was using the Rio Frio caves. Novotny is aligned primarily east to west, as you can see here. There's 3 or 4 plazas. There's likely another plaza here, but we have not been able to fully map that yet. We've mapped between 20 to 30 structures in the site core. The main pyramid here stands about 8 meters tall, and these are very tall range structures here, upwards of 4 meters tall themselves. The site has a minimum of 2 monuments, neither of which are carved, and the site is largely intact with very little pot hunting activity. We've only so far seen about 4 or 5 looters' trenches in this entire site. In summer 2022, I got to return following COVID, and we targeted our investigations in Plaza 1, where there was the looter trench and a stela. We primarily worked on cleaning out the looter's trench, but we also placed an excavation unit in front of the stela, which you can see here. And our focus was on the stela and the looter's trench, simply to learn the chronology of the site. With the stela, we were hoping to uncover a cache, and with the looter's trench, we were looking to recover any artifacts that had been left behind from the pot hunting activities. So our excavations in this site are incredibly limited so far, and here's some of my team. We got Franklin on the left, Michaela, Moshi, and Ronnie in the back. We did excavate down. We found a floor that the stela had been toppled on, and then we carefully moved it off to the side so we can excavate underneath it. This is a profile view of the unit, and what we see here on the left are the remnants of the construction material. This area we left unexcavated because the stela is standing right in front of it right here. But we actually identified 2 floors, neither of which were plastered. But we did encounter the remnants of a plaster floor right at the foot of what seems to be the foot of the stela, although the stela continues down below it. Unfortunately, we reached this at the end of the season, so we couldn't excavate any further here. Now, as we had set up our shaker screen for our excavation unit over here in Stela 1, we set up a shaker screen over here, this screen, and we wound up uncovering yet another stela on the other side of the plaza from Stela 1. So this is our other stela, and here's a side-by-side comparison of them. Both are made from phyllite, which is a slightly metamorphosized slate, and so they glisten, almost like they shimmer like oil on water. Neither are carved. Both have been snapped. We didn't excavate Stela 2, but Stela 1 actually was laying on the terminal floor. We assume that Stela 2 is also, and this represents probably a termination of the site. So these would have been paired stela on either side of this structure here. Now of interest is here, where the red circle is, which would have been right up against the side of the stela, sitting on the plaza floor, was this small vessel. And we'll come back to the significance of that in just a few minutes. I want to turn now to talk to a little bit about our looter trench cleaning activities. So here's a profile view of the side of the looter's trench. So this is the back of the structure over here, the floor, the jungle floor, and then this is the top of the structure over here. We've noted about 2 to 3 major construction episodes in this profile here. There's a big expansion over here. So we got one phase here, another phase here, possibly a third phase right here. So we have 2, possibly 3 phases of architecture here, which matches up fairly well with the excavation at the front of the structure, which we have found 3 plaza floors. So it's likely that the plaza floors that we encountered are equated with these construction episodes. In here, just a couple pieces of note that I want to point out are we recovered several speleothem fragments, cave fragments, as well as several of these spikes, which are probably coming from incense burners. Right? So there's quite a lot of ritual activity happening at this structure. We also found in the Looter's Trench, we found this applique piece right here. Now comparing these, this small vessel that we found next to Stela 1 and this nose piece right here, this piece right here, these do seem to be related to kinds of vessels found, late classic period vessels found at Caracol. So it looks like this vessel here is probably a spiked lid of an incense burner. And this here is two round diadems here, and this long shaft right here is likely a nose of what was called face cast vessels at Caracol. Both these vessel types date to the late classic period, so we're looking at a late classic period date for this site. So what are some very preliminary results of our 2022 field season? Well, we focused mainly on mapping and cleaning looters' trenches. Very little excavation besides the stela. And lab work's yet to get underway, so we've really very preliminary results here. But it looks like we have 2 to 3 phases of construction and the stela excavations. Ceramic styles demonstrate a very strong late classic to terminal classic period occupation of at least this portion of the site, and there's some earlier material and some from the late early classic period and possibly some later early post-classic material. So we're looking at a site that was occupied probably during throughout the classic period and possibly into the early post-classic, which makes sense given the snapping of the stela and the caching of that vessel. The geographic proximity to the Rio Frio caves, the formations in the construction material, and there's also several shared ceramic types to the cave assemblages. Temporal proximity. This all suggests that that people from this site were the ones using the Rio Frio caves. So now that we seem to have identified this primary question of my original cave project, what is the future questions that I have? Well, we need to get to learn more of the site's chronology. Are there more architecturally complex part of the site older than Plaza 1, or are they the same age? How far does the core and hinterland settlement extend? Right? Local knowledge indicates that mounds and other broadly forested areas of the Mountain Pine Ridge Forest Reserve are present, including directly on this other side of the Rio Frio. So does the site core extend that far, or are these mounds part of a different site? Right? Is there, if more of a dispersed rural settlement is located, were they affiliated with Nohochbatzo? What about some of the other caves in the area, not in the immediate Rio Frio Valley? Were those being used by the people from this site? Clearly we have a lot of more research to do up here, but it does seem that we have finally answered the question of who was using the Rio Frio caves. And with that, I want to say thank you again to the Heritage Education Network Belize and all of these folks and many more for all their work with this project and their support over the years. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thank you, Dr. Spenard. It's funny how we start a symposium talking about the importance of storytelling and how that communicates the Belizeanness within us. And your presentation, even though it was pre-recorded a while ago, also starts off with that storytelling aspect. So thank you for expanding our understanding of the Mountain Pine Ridge. I am sure there are many questions about the new site, and speaking of questions, we would like to remind our audience that the question and answer segment is scheduled for the end of each thematic session. This morning's session ends at 10:15, so get your questions lined up. We will have all our presenters here with us for that audience engagement. Our third presentation is by Mr. Alexandre Solcà. Mr. Solcà is from Switzerland and has done most of his studies on ancient Greek linguistics, Egyptology, and Latin. He has also studied early Scandinavia, and ruins, and began studying early poetry on the Anglo-Saxon time period. 4 years ago, he moved on to learning Maya phonology and hieroglyphics and contributed to 4 articles within journals in collaboration with specialist Dr. or Professor Houk. Currently, he investigates early Maya trading posts and cult evidence in Belize with local Belizean ethnic cultures. We move on to Belizean early Maya trade points and cult evidence with local traditional cultures in our third presentation for this morning.
Hello, dear committee members of the Heritage Education Network and other participants of this Congress, dear Internet co-participants as well, buenos dias, and thank you for your attention. Today I'm going to speak about Belizean early Maya trade points and cult evidence with local traditional cultures. On my Word file you can find all my details, so please feel free to speak with me after this presentation. A warm thank you to allow me presenting some small aspects of our researches on Mesoamerican early contacts between Belize and central Guatemalan rainforest, early trade routes such as those still used in the Usumacinta region. Indeed, as always, a better knowledge of earliest cultures goes with a deep knowledge of the local geography and customs of those living in the area we study. I do not have yet local Belizean friends, but I'm looking very forward to it after this colloquium, and meanwhile I will wish to present some very useful publication I use for my own researches and how this could be a pertinent multidisciplinary approach study for Belizean and Guatemalan future historical and geographical research projects. We understand quite clearly from the map of local Maya southern sites that Belize is actually a very rich region of trade contacts for Maya lords and the subsequent allies. Therefore, it seems to be worth investigating which Maya early local cultural points had impact with Belizean regional traditional centers of communication and exchanges. An obvious point to start our research was Mountain Co, also known as Tsiminkax and Atzkaabkil. One artifact in particular got us into deeper thoughts regarding early Belizean cults and Maya connections. The so-called Atzkaabkil mountain crow axe, currently kept in the Field Museum and excavated in 1931 by one of the most renowned archaeologists of Maya civilization, Sir John Eric Sidney Thompson, and in particular the article of David Moramarin gave us very interesting insight. Quite obviously, we can observe clearly that Mayas had important trade connections towards Belize, and it seems to us really useful to trace which geographical and cultural exchanges were then built and can still be found even in modern times. We selected a few elements for our presentation. 1. Maya statues or fragments of cult devotion found in Belize. 2. Local Belizean legends and early ethnographical materials on rivers and waterfalls. 3. How to organize cultural expeditions on early Maya territories through Belizean trails as well as focusing on Olmec's remains. This short scheme allows us to focus on the most important phases of our contacts and see how these two civilizations build their own territories in connection with each other, and not entirely separated as some scholars try to explain. Chronologically, Olmecs preceded Maya, but that doesn't mean they were not in touch with earlier Belizean and South Guatemalan cultures. Indeed, we must proceed diligently when assessing which were the first outposts of Olmec civilization in this region. To learn much more on this fascinating part of early Mesoamerican complex history, there is an excellent resource I recommend to everyone, and it's a wonderful website made by a very interesting specialist, ambiasquisque.com, pages Maya, mayanscience.html. We show you now some key answer sites, which material we can expect to find and where we made some interesting discoveries. We can understand that many of early Olmec and Maya training of sacred places are directly connected to each other. First in reason of access to water resources, but also in relation with jade and obsidian locations of exploitation. Lamanai, in particular, contains a very interesting so-called Olmec sun god temple of a mask. And here I would like to quote a small article related to Lamanai and the structure number 956, in which huge marks are quite unusual as they are carved limestone rather than molded stucco, which was far more common for large pieces during this period. The masks that are thought to represent one of Lamanai's early rulers. He wears a crocodile headdress, which further supports the idea that the city was called Lamanai all through the classic period. The mask features characteristic of Olmec influence, such as the rubbery lips with an upturned top lip and wide, so-called African nose. Structure number 956 was unfortunately demolished and then rebuilt to a mortuary temple in the middle of the 5th century after Christ. The burials were of a male and a female, with a male burial containing a large number of jade artifacts, which could indicate a trade network with Copan, or Quirigua, or at least the people of that region, as the burials date approximately to the same cities when the time of the chain mines of Guatemala. And it would be excellent, of course, if further excavations were done precisely on the Lamanai area, but clearly there are connections with early Olmec traditions and trading activities. And if committee shows the word file I sent with you, you will see the beautiful Lamanai structure. Sensor you can see just below explains quite clearly which gods and natural creatures were worshipped back then around Lamanai. Here I would like to thank Mr. Robin Hayworth for great photography done in 2002. And after this, there is an interesting element that means why crocodiles were an important aspect of ritual cults in Belize and possibly as well as in southern Yucatan region. In association with crocodile worshipping in Maya times, we must think especially about Izamna, because this crocodile, clouding, transforming wizard and foreteller god could take many forms, and among them those of a crocodile or a sort of two-headed winged snake with bird creatures. Indeed, in some Maya language, Izamna means caiman, lizard or large fish, and the its part remembers of a number of things, among them dew, or stuff of the clouds, but also divination or witchcraft in colonial Yucatec, and foretell and contemplate. And obviously he has many names, and among them Hitzam Kamhain, the Ezam of Cayman. By the way, Zamna is very important in later Maya codices, and we intend soon to bring some new evidence on the Izam worship aspects between Maya and Olmec cults, but quite clearly the god Izam had many forms which were incarnations of water animals and crocodile in particular. We could make any other information on your topic, but these are the main elements we wish to discuss with all the participants. Thank you for your attention and look very forward to your comments and suggestions. Good luck to everyone, and please free to contact us during this session or by email and WhatsApp anytime you like. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias. Thank you, and looking forward your reply.
Thank you very much, Alexandre. Wrapping up our Ancient Maya Archaeology Regional Questions session is a presentation done by Dr. Claire Novotny, Tomás, Gallareta, Cervera, Dr. Bert Houk, and Dr. Anna Novotny. Dr. Claire Novotny is an associate professor of anthropology at Kenyon State in Gambier, Ohio. She is currently the associate director of the Chich Archaeology Project and the Belize Estates Archaeology Survey team, where she conducts research on ancient Maya households at the site of Galanjog. She conducted her dissertation research in southern Belize, where she designed and implemented a community archaeology project with Aguacate Village. We now move to northern Belize, where we look at the presentation from Chich.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for attending the KULCHA Symposium. Our paper is called Archaeology in a Company Town, the case study of Chich Archaeological Project. My name is Tomás Gallareta Cervera, and I will be presenting the paper in place of Novotny, who is currently sick. We would like to thank the organizers, the Heritage Education Network Belize, for inviting us to participate. Our work in Belize is sponsored by the following organizations who we would like to thank for their support. Communicating knowledge about the past to the wider public has been part of archaeological research for decades now. In Belize, public outreach is a condition outlined on the excavation permit by the Institute of Archaeology, but activities involved in engagement are left to the discussion of the archaeologist. Indeed, archaeologists go beyond the dissemination of archaeological research materials. Much of the literature on engagement focuses on descendant communities who have the biggest stake in the creation of knowledge about the past. However, less analysis has been done about archaeological projects who engage communities geographically local to archaeological sites, regardless of their ancestry or descent. Non-Maya local groups are also important stakeholders and audiences for archaeological. It is from this vantage that we consider the challenges and opportunities of public outreach among those residing and visiting the Chich Archaeological Site and the Greater Gallon Jug property. The Chich Archaeological Project, or CCAP, is located in northwestern Belize, a land owned by the Gallon Jug State's agribusiness. The communities of Sylvester Village and Chich are company towns built in the late 1980s that draw people from all over the Central America to work in the agribusiness, and at Chich lodge as laborers, cowboys, mechanics, servers, cooks, among other jobs. As a result, no one really has a deep tie to the land or its history. Very few residents have generational ties to the area, and most have lived there for fewer than a decade. For this reason, the CCAP has struggled with how to disseminate information about our research to local people. The Chich Archaeological Project and its regional component, the Belize Estates Archaeological Survey Team, operate in northwestern Belize on lands currently owned by Bowen & Bowen and the Belize Maya Forest Trust. Our permit area covers 590 square kilometers, or roughly 145,000 acres, of mostly forested land. Prior to the 1850s, this part of Belize was largely unexplored by Europeans, but as mahogany became increasingly important to the fledgling colony, logging companies began to push into the region. During the mid to late 1800s, Qualm Hill Camp was the seasonal headquarters of British Honduras Company, or BHC, which became the Belize Estate and Produce Company, or BEC, in 1875. Qual Hill Camp is within our permit area and important to the history of Belize, as the site is an infamous Ikaiche Maya raid that resulted in the death of one Garifuna man at the camp and the capture of around 80 other men, including women and children. Archival data suggests that BC began the railway in 1910 at Hillbank and gradually pushed the track deeper into the forest, reaching Sierra de Agua at 1927, Wamil in 1939, and Gallon Jug in 1942. Gallon Jug became the headquarters for the company and grew into a small town with an airstrip, a school, a police station. By that time, BEC was the largest logging firm in Belize during the 20th century, ultimately possessing over half of all privately owned land in Belize before going bankrupt in 1970. With the bankruptcy, BEC abandoned Gallon Jug, and the former village fell into disrepair. We won't go into details of the rather complicated land dealings that followed, but in sum, Barry Bowen ended up purchasing a large chunk of the former BEC holdings and established Gallon Jug Ranch on roughly 125,000 acres in the 1980s. He reopened Gallon Jug and built a company town called Sylvester Village and at the former Sebal camp. He also established the Chich Lodge, a 12-cabana jungle lodge in the main plaza of the Maya site of Chich. With a handful of old-timers from the BEC days returned when Bowen established Gallon Jug Ranch, almost everybody who lives and works there came from somewhere else. Hence, currently no one there now has a tie to the historic town of Gallon Jug. Following Bowen's death in 2010, Bowen & Bowen, the corporation that owns Gallant Jug Ranch in Chich, has struggled to turn what was Barry Bowen's hobby into a profitable business enterprise. As a result, the number of people working at the ranch and at the lodge is less than half of what it used to be, and employee turnover is high, particularly among unskilled laborers. Following Bowen's death, his stepson contacted Houk and asked him to restart the project. The CCAP began operating again in 2012 and added the entire Gallant Jug Ranch to its permit area in 2013. There have been further land deals since then, and today the project area includes what remains of the Gallant Jug Ranch, with its about 25,000 acres and a large portion of the newly established Belize Maya Forest Trust, which surrounds Gallant Jug. It is nearly universal to say that archaeological research is defined by the local land use and ownership. The CCAP, like many others, is shaped in part by the history of restrictions and priorities of the Gallant Jug organization, as detailed above. The project is viewed by management as guests of the lodge, and as such, we are constrained in where we go, what to do, we interact. Our status as researchers to some parts of the landscape, such as archaeological sites, but not others. For example, we are disencouraged from socializing in the villages. Employees of Gallant Jug also have restricted economical opportunities because they do not own the land on which their village sits. Thus, we are conducting research about the past in a landscape tightly managed by Gallant Jug, which is why we view it as a company town. Given this complex and transactional history, the CCAP has focused its engagement efforts on multiple audiences: local community members, specifically school children at Casey Community School in Gallant Jug, and a broader international audience, including tourists who visit the Chich Lodge and give clicks to their social media. Though Sylvester Village may be characterized economically by short-term employment, there are established families who send their children to Casey Community School. The school is located on the Gallant Jug Ranch and includes a preschool, kindergarten, and primary school offering standards 1 to 6. The school serves Sylvester Village and children from the Chich area. However, older children leave the community to attend secondary school in Orange Walk or Cayo. CCAP project members attended the primary school graduation every year, and both Brett Houk and Tomás Gallareta Cervera have been invited to speak at the ceremony. In 2018, the project partnered with Casey Community School to visit students and discuss our recent work at Chich. The staff visit included a hands-on display of artifacts. These included stone axes for chopping trees and cutting grass, obsidian blades for cutting food, ceramic whistles, and historic coins from the Chicle gathering era. The students were never shy. They asked multiple questions such as, what were they for? Where did they come from? How old were they? And of course, did the Maya make them? As staff members explained the function of artifacts, students felt a connection with objects used for everyday activities in the past. This connection is important because many of the children's family members come into contact with the archaeological landscape through their work as ranch hands or farmers at Gallant Jug and have worked with the CCAP as excavators. Speaking with the students creates a context for their family members' work as well as their observations about artifacts or sites in and around the Gallant Jug area. As part of the classroom visit, the CCIP project members Trudy Kilgore and Claire Novotny made an activity book to give to students. The books can double as coloring books and are an accessible and fun way to convey information. Though they are aimed at children, often parents or older siblings will read content or help with the puzzles as well. Importantly, they make archaeological information mobile and unfettered to foreign archaeologists who are only in Belize for a few months of the year. The CCIP coloring book includes basic information about archaeology and archaeological methods, as well as cultural information interspread with activities like word search and mazes. It provides a working document for the project to add when discoveries are made. For example, we plan to revising it and adding sections on mapping and finding new sites, such as Tiking Ha. Another avenue of engagement is through games. Games for leisure, competition, or ritual activity are a cross-cultural phenomena that can also have a didactic purpose. In 2019, we discovered multiple patoli boards incised into the floor of a residential structure at the site of Gallon Jug. We are designing a playable patoli game board based on the ones discovered at Gallon Jug that incorporates information about regional archaeological sites. The rules of Maya patoli boards are unknown, but we will use ethnohistoric sources to establish playable rules. Targeted primarily at children, but also at family members, we envision a game in which players roll dice and progress along spaces to reach different destinations, perhaps represented as local archaeological sites. Along the way, one might lose a turn or have to go back several spaces to keep it challenging. The back of the game board will have more detailed information about the Gallon Jug patoli in order to ground the game in a specific place, one that has meaning for local people. Similar to the activity books, game boards are also mobile means of distributing information. In addition to engaging local community, count for tourists as an audience as well. They are interested in archaeology and conservation. While working at Chich, project members are available to the guests to give tours and updates on our ongoing research. In 2012, Brett Houk wrote a guidebook about the site for guests to follow along the multiple trails on the property that went through the archaeological site. The Upper Plaza has been the focus of excavation of CCAP since 2016. The project has worked with the lodge to update the signage in the Upper Plaza with new information about our discoveries with current, high-quality images. The lodge promotes conservation of the natural environment and shows how the cultural environment can also be protected and enjoyed. Our final audience is an international online community that is interested in archaeology and uses social media apps like Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok. During our 2022 season, Tomás Gallareta Cervera filmed short reels for our Instagram page with his iPhone, featuring different aspects of our fieldwork. Reels covered excavation updates using technology in the field and project traditions, among other topics. While our social media footprint is not that big yet, the reels are quick, visual, and entertaining ways to engage with a wider audience. You're watching an extended version of those right now. The transactional nature of the company town can make it difficult to visualize a cohesive community. Having said that, there are examples of families which sustain ties to Sylvester Village. There are multiple men who have worked as excavators on other regional archaeological projects since the 1990s. Children who were raised at Chich and in Sylvester Village have come back to work on the property after finishing their education. The business also draws people from all over Belize, including people of Maya descent who express interest in learning about their ancestors. The history of Gallon Jug shapes what is possible for us in terms of community engagement. We contend that an important aspect of reaching out to interested stakeholders is meeting them when they are in terms of geography, but also of technology and interest. We think it's important for our research to make it into the hands of young people who attend Casey Community School who can share it with their families. Activities should also be approachable and fun, including games. Since some families may move on from the region, the activity book and game can be taken with them, and learning about archaeology is not tied to seasonal visits from the CCAP archaeologists. Visit John Chich can learn more about the reservation efforts by visiting the site and using the guidebook. Belizeans as well as foreign visitors may have access to social media and can keep up with the project through Instagram Reels. Communities are not monoliths, frozen in time and attached by gravity to space. Instead, communities change and people come and go for different reasons. People give meaning to places through the oldest cultural practice in the human cognitive repertoire, storytelling. And the material record is a critical element of storytelling. The archaeology helps to create and reinforce connections with the landscape. We hope that our project can contribute to the Gallant Jug history, no matter who lives on the landscape. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Dr. Claire Novotny and to Dr. Tomás Gallareta Cervera. That brings up a wrap to our first session of our KULCHA Symposium, Ancient Maya Archaeology. So we now invite our presenters who are with us on the back end for our question and answer segment. And we also remind the audience that this is a live question and answer segment. So our presenters are here and are available to answer your questions. We bring on Dr. Fred Valdez, we bring on Dr. John Spenard, we bring on Dr. Claire Novotny. And Dr. Brett Houk, thank you very much for joining us. Welcome. Thank you for being on our first panel for our second annual KULCHA Symposium. I see there are a couple questions in comments here for you all. But first, before we get to that, thank you so much for joining us and for your presentations and for being here and engaging with our audience. We have our first question from Ms. Villarreal, who is known to you all. And her question is for Dr. Valdez. So it reads, do we see other ceramics or artifacts with interlocking technologies, or is that chocolate pot unique in the Maya world? What might this mean about the Preclassic Maya responsible for that vessel and burial?
Wow. Can you hear me? All right.
Yes, we can hear
Okay.
you.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. The answer is I'm not sure. There's lots of technologies that are introduced over time as the Maya see particular needs, and it's perhaps not amazing, but for me personally, just how they're able to address and come up with solutions to problems that come along. That one chocolate pot that has the interlocking part is a very special piece, but I've seen square vessels that were used in the past, and even those earlier spouted vessels, those spouted chocolate pots. The reality is those spouts are not for pouring as we would tend to think about them. If you go to pour out of them, if you were to put anything in them and to go pour, it comes out of the top of the vessel before it comes out of the spout. So those spouts also have a particular technological advantage and a use, whether it's to add something or to help with whatever's cooking or fermenting or whatever may be within the pot. It is hard to tell at this time. But certainly the technology of the Maya has almost always has some practical aspect to it. I hope that answered that question.
I am sure if it did not answer, Ali will reach out with more technical ceramics questions to you. Thank you very much for that answer. And thank you very much for acknowledging that, we don't always know the answers, and that's okay. That's part of the research, and that is part of the inference that we can make from material remains. We move on to a question, and this is for the Chich project. And so we have somebody asking if you can elaborate more on the relationship with Bowen and Bowen and the community and how this impacts your research. And I think this sort of ties into some of what Dr. Rebecca Fidel Juan has also asked in the comment, where she makes mention of that aspect that you are discouraged from interacting with the local community, and you all presenting some of what your project has tried to do to break out of this norm. And if you could then comment on what your project is doing, and perhaps commenting on sort of this new approaches to community or public archaeology that we're seeing across Belize.
Great, thank you for those questions. First, I just want to take 1 second and say that we wanted to dedicate our paper today to a project member that passed away unexpectedly this week. Jose Pinello, who worked with us for several seasons. And so we just want to say that we're thinking about our team members in Belize this week as well, as we talk about this project and the engagement that we've tried to do with the community. So the relationship first between Bowen and Chich, or with the community, I guess. I think that I might have to punt this one over to Dr. Houk because he's worked with Bowen for longer than I have. But I think in our paper, we tried to explain that our relationship with the community is structured based on this company town, right, where they're working. And so we don't have access to labor in the same kind of way because the people that live there have their schedules kind of dictated by the company. And so that kind of shapes what we're able to do in terms of research. But in terms of the longer term relationship, Brett, do you want to comment on that?
Sure. Thank you. Thanks everybody for attending, and thanks Sylvia for moderating this session. Yeah, so our relationship started a long time ago, and Bowen's obviously an important company in Belize and a very large company. And Chich and Gallon Jug are just two elements of Bowen. And so throughout the years, we've pretty much interacted either directly with the management of Chich, and that's how it started in the early days, and more recently with the management at Gallon Jug. And so we're sort of insulated from dealing with the actual corporation, Bowen itself, and we deal with Gallon Jug Agro Industries. But as a wing of the corporation, their job is to make money, and they have corporate policies that are in place about who can be on the property, what you're doing there. And so that affects our labor and how we get people to come work with us. There's not just a pool of people sitting around looking for work. Everyone there has a job or is a family member of somebody with a job. So that, in a sense, affects us and our relationship with the community to a degree. Because we're also paying to be there, we're sort of treated as guests, and maybe not as research partners. And so we're discouraged the same way that a guest would be, if you were a guest of the lodge, would be discouraged from going to someone's house in Sylvester Village and hanging out on the weekend, because that's their private time. And there's sort of a boundary that's established or created from that corporate structure. And a lot of projects don't necessarily have that same kind of restriction. And so that's why we look at some of our engagement with Gallon Jug as transactional. We're paying a fee to be there. They feel like they're providing a service to us. And there's sort of an unconventional arrangement that most archaeological projects, I think, in the country don't have with the land, with the people, and with the company. I hope that answered Bay's question. And if, Claire, you want to take Rebecca's question.
Yes, thanks, Brett. Well, I think that making things the norm across archaeological projects, I mean, I think that really depends on the goals of the project. And I think, like we say a little bit in the paper at the beginning, like some of this is shaped by permit requirements. And so perhaps there are more specific ways that government agencies in Belize can support outreach. Like I said, it is required, so that makes it a norm in some degree, but the actual activities that people do are really subject to what is possible. And I think one of the things that we find unique about our situation that Brett has just elaborated on is that we are trying to operate within these constraints while still trying to engage people that live there. And what we find is that there really are communities everywhere. And even in a place that is seemingly restricted and does have a lot of movement in terms of labor and residency, that you can still find people that are interested in archaeology. You can still find people that want to know about their own relation to the landscape and their everyday lives. And that really shapes the way that we have been able to reach out to people. And so, I don't have any influence over government policy, but that is what I would say as a potentially, in terms of permit requirements, that's the one avenue forward, I suppose, is being a little bit more specific about what people do, but it just is so variable, which is in some ways great because you can work with what you have and really be creative and thinking about how to engage. I hope I answered that question, Rebecca. Thank you for asking.
Thank you both for taking on different portions of those questions. I will say that we do have a presentation tomorrow looking at British colonial policies toward the Ikaiche Maya, which are sort of tied and connected to, your modern day experiences with archaeological investigations at Chich and that view of them as a company town. So thank you for that. Before we move on to the other questions, since they seem to be for Dr. Valdez and Dr. Spenard, I'd like to, if Chich can comment on how their in community engagement resources can be accessed. So the workbook looked really, really great. If you can share about that, but also about your social media. Give yourself a little plug.
Thanks, Sylvia. We do have copies of the workbook. I believe it's on the website through Texas Tech, but if it's not, we will put it up there. People can use it as inspiration or a template. We're happy to share resources if you want to reach out to me also over email. We can get you a version of it. And like we said in the paper, we're consistently revising it and trying to think of new ways to reach out based on our current research, like the Patoli boards, for example. And then on social media, we are at Chich Arc Project, I believe, on Instagram. And there's, of course, a Facebook page as well. And Dr. Tomás Gallareta Cervera has been in charge of those videos. So his editorial brilliance is what you saw today with our paper. And yeah, so those are our social media accounts. You can follow us there. Things are slow right now since we're not in the field, but we would love to hear from people over social media.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for those comments and answers. Reach out by email, audience members. All right, we have a question for Dr. Valdez, and this is asking about the estimated population densities per kilometer square in the Lake Classic in your research area, and would raised fields allow for much higher population densities? And this is from Mr. Juan.
Okay, Rodolfo Juan, thank you very much for that question. The specific answer about population density per square kilometer is, I don't know. The second part with that is, I'm always hesitant, even if I think I know or I'm told, because of the way population numbers are counted and so forth. It's just my personal issue. So I always kick that ball over to somebody else to have to mess with. But would raised fields allow for much higher densities? Absolutely. You now have, with raised fields, a second growing season, even in the rainy season. So there's a lot more food production that both will support the local population, but provide surpluses. So you can support larger populations, and you have materials that can perhaps be traded and moved around to different areas if so needed. So that's the short answer to all of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Valdez. We have a question for Dr. John Spenard. The question reads, it's also about population density. Do you have any guesses as to the population size of the Maya in the Mountain Pine Ridge?
That's a really great question, Monty. Thanks for asking that. And unfortunately, I'm going to have to plead the fifth, like Professor Valdez just did. We really don't know. As you saw when you came out, Monty, the forest back there is incredibly thick, and it's been really difficult to survey. And with COVID, we had just only started our project there this summer, and we had just a few weeks back there. One of the things that I've noticed, though, walking around that valley, is that I haven't seen very many what potentially would be house mounds in and around the site, and we haven't extensively surveyed that valley yet. But when we've gone out away from the plaza areas, there just doesn't look like there's much settlement out there besides those plaza groups. And so one of the really fascinating questions that I have so far right now is we figured out people who were using the caves, but where were those people actually living?
is kind of the next question. And I do anticipate. We did get some LiDAR done of the forested area, so hopefully in the next couple of weeks or months, we'll have a much better idea of where those folks are living, when we can start talking about population size. So until that's out there, we don't have very many house mounds, and so it's really difficult to say right now because we just don't know much about the area yet, because of the thickness of the jungle and how remote it is to get back there. So, but check back in a couple months and I can give you a better answer.
Thank you very much for that. And since both of these questions are about population size or population density, perhaps Dr. Valdez or Dr. Spenard, could you share just very quickly how population sizes and densities are measured? Because I think for a lot of Belizeans, one of their questions is always how many people lived here? What time period was this in? How are these things measured? And so we can have very detailed archaeological information, and then on the other end we have persons who have that level of curiosity about how many people were represented or within the maybe classic time period. And so if you could share for our non-archaeological audiences, how do we measure population size or population density?
Hey, wait, Fred, John, I'm going to write this down, so I'm going to take some notes on your answer.
Let me jump in there. Dr. Houk, you know how to write? So, all right. So this is why I have an issue with population estimates, because there's a tremendous range depending on who you speak with and what kind of system they want to use to determine it. The more obvious way would be, as John Spenard mentioned, you would want to count house mounds, and you want to see where are they, and you're estimating how many people would be living in these structures. But we also have to remember that some of these are not necessarily house mounds. They functioned in some other capacities. They may have been storerooms. They may have been areas for crafting or processing foods and so forth. So they aren't all livable space in that sense. So what tends to happen is you count up these house mounds, and then you're going to remove a certain percentage because you're going to discount those as being living space. And then you're going to guesstimate perhaps 4 people or 5 people or 4.5 people per mound and multiply that across there. And you come up with this magical number, and you sort of, from my perspective, only being a little bit cynical, you pretend like this is really what it is. This is how many people were here. I've heard estimates, for example, for pre-European Belize, when Belize was a Maya country and so forth, of population numbers perhaps at its peak up to 3 million people in Belize. That's phenomenal. I don't think there's any question that the resources within the country could support such a population, and particularly with some of the ways that the Maya had available to them, with like these raised fields and terrace fields and intensive horticulture that was taking place. The problem with, as I say, the problem with population numbers is, the real question is, how did you get to those numbers, and is that something that a formula or a process that I am willing to believe? Dr. Spenard mentioned something that is critical to this, and it applies to all of these projects in the north at least. There's been a lot of recent LiDAR work, and I think that's going to help in terms of being able to look at settlement across the areas. But then the question there even becomes, but how fine-tuned is that? Are we seeing the smallest of structures? And then there are structures that are known as invisible structures. You're excavating an area, not thinking anybody lived there, and right at surface or below, you come across house structures, which on the surface would be something you would never have counted to begin with. So sorry, there's no direct answer to that, and kind of long-winded there, but if anybody else would like to add their part, that's just my bias about how I see population numbers. It could be almost anything.
Would anybody else like to jump in? I know I asked a question, I got some ha-has in the comments, so.
I can add one more point to Fred Valdez's argument. The other thing about archaeology and populations is that, I mean, it's one of the most difficult things to do in archaeology because there's just so many factors. As Dr. Valdez said, some structures might be sometimes used for storage, sometimes they may be reused as houses or vice versa. And the other thing is that, well, we tend to imagine archaeological sites as if they were all populated at the same time and had all this really big, families and whatnot. But, one of the things that the archaeological record tells us is that not everything was populated at the same time. In other words, there are ruins in the past, to quote Dr. Statton's book's name. So there's a lot of, so anyway, so it's really hard to calculate because we don't really know precisely when those buildings are abandoned. We can only do a guesstimate of what the population might be, right? There's also areas like in Chich, we have the Upper Plaza, which at some point was populated by the elite, but maybe at some point it was not depopulated, but it was populated less extensively because it was looked at as a shrine. Same thing happens in the Yucatan in Kiwik. So it varies a lot. Human behavior is really difficult to predict, really. That's my 2 cents.
Thank you both for your interventions and allowing me to segue this conversation a little bit more toward population densities. So the reason why I asked is, again, because those are questions that I think are posed to Belizean archaeologists quite a bit, or when it comes to outreach, you can have, all these great stuff of maybe a marketplace or, craft or tool productions. And then the question that follows is, how many people were here? How many people were here in Xunantunich or Cajalpet or any of these site cores? And I think that shows, one, what is interesting for a Belizean person when it comes to their understanding of their past, which also goes to show what sort of information is of interest and what information they try to connect with, and how they try to sort of see and understand the past through these connections to people, but through different areas that maybe are very, very difficult for an archaeologist to estimate. And also acknowledging that a lot of these theories in certain areas are, it's your best estimate based on evidence that is found. And so also approaching archaeological information as, an archaeologist also is not having these absolute sources of information, but that it is evidence-based and it is based on material that is left behind. And sometimes there are gaps in that material record. And so we cannot say, yes, with certainty, we know all of these things from these time periods. But thank you very much for allowing me to sort of guide that discussion in that way. We have a couple more questions. Since we have a little bit more time for our question and answer, I'll pull up the first question from Ali again. She said, for the Chich group, and Dr. Spenard, do ancient movements of populations around caves in the mountain pine ridge give us a deeper understanding of current movements of populations around Chich and Galanjug? Is it a multi-generational tie to a specific location, more relevant now in relation to land rights, politics, etc.?
We don't know enough yet about the Maya and the Pine Ridge to know if, and maybe I'm misunderstanding the question, but if there's a relationship between Mountain Pine Ridge and Chich and Galanjug. The caves, and I mentioned this briefly in the presentation, but the caves were not habitation spaces for the Maya. They were simply just there's too many logistical issues with them for a whole variety of reasons. There's health concerns, et cetera, that don't make them useful, really livable for long-term habitation. Short-term, possibly, refuges and things like that. But in terms of habitation, definitely not. And so I think what we're seeing in the Pine Ridge is not so much a movement of populations, but rather like we see elsewhere in the Belize Valley and elsewhere in the Maya lowlands, is local populations using local geography for rituals. And I do see another question here, and I'll tie this into that my answer to that question about working with local Maya communities. We do see that Maya communities today still think the lands still perform rituals to the landscape. The landscape's considered alive. It's the source of life, and so your local hill and your local mountain typically is seen as the ultimate landowner who you must petition to. So we see local populations using the caves for these rituals, oftentimes agricultural rituals, ancestral rituals, and things like that. So I don't know. I can't say yet whether or not there's populations moving around the Pine Ridge. Nowakowski does. There's at least three construction phases there, so that does suggest that folks were living there for at least several generations. And so, in terms of them moving around, can't say much about that yet because the research there is so new and we're just starting out.
Thank you very much for the answer. We have time for one or two more questions. This question is from Elder Vasquez, and he asks, have you tried or considered handing over a Maya artifact to a Maya descendant and seeing what he or she does with it in order to get information as to the past? So I think looking more at the intersections with anthropology and archaeology and experimental archaeology and stuff like that. Has anybody incorporated that into a project?
I can give an anecdote about this, and I've worked very closely with the community of San Antonio, and I often and this is true. I've never found any site. Oftentimes it's my local collaborators, my foreman Avi, who brings me to the sites that he knows about. He didn't know about Nohochbatso, so that was exciting. We kind of all found that one together. But in terms of anything else I've ever done, all the sites, is typically his knowledge of the landscape that has allowed me to do the research. But when I was working on my dissertation project up near Pakpatun, we were doing some cave work within the Pine Ridge, and we actually found one of my team members, Oscar, found a small tripod plate in the cave, and he spent some time looking for a second one because he said, there should be two because there's male-female complementarity, and so he said that there was another plate here in the past, another vessel with this catch, because of this idea of male-female complementarity, that something's not complete without a male and female. And so he said there at some point in the past there was another vessel there. And so part of my interpretation of that was including that in the discussion of that cave and understanding that cache that was there. So we do see there's sort of anecdotal things that come up like that in the research that I do. But there's a whole field of, as Sylvia mentioned, experimental archaeology, where anthropologists and archaeologists work with communities, and we'll actually see some of this in some of the other presentations in the symposium about recreating past technologies to understand how those were made and how they were used. So your question is an entire field of archaeology and anthropology.
Thank you very much for that, John. Yes, so an entire field of archaeology and anthropology and its intersections, but also some of the papers that we're trying to bring to the forefront within the symposium. So Ali, who is in the comments, I believe last year, spoke about experimental archaeology and looking at understanding ceramic production with the assistance of local ceramicists in Belize. And there was a similar paper also with Frank Sim and his contributions as a ceramicist to the understanding of how production would have been done in the past. And so also looking at how connections can be made to the past through these productions of ceramics today. So there are projects in Belize that utilize that, and I feel like sometimes what we bring to the forefront, since there's such a wealth of information and also different techniques to get that information, is you get the answers, you get the this is what we have learned. And so Culture Symposium is a space where we also try to bring to the forefront the different unique and innovative research practices that we're seeing here in Belize. So long answer, yes, it does occur. And there are presentations from last year and this year that will highlight some of that. So we hope that you tune in and that you stay with us. We have one quick question, again for Chich, and it says, are the ceramics from Chich from a specific time period or different time periods?
Hi, Marie. That's a good question. Marie worked with us this year. She actually was in one of the pictures up on our presentation. The ceramics from Chich are from multiple time periods, going back as early as in the Upper Plaza. I think you guys have middle Preclassic, I want to say, ceramics, and all the way going to actually the historic period, which is something I wanted to point out as well. Which I'll come back to in a second. But yes, Marie, there are ceramics from all different time periods. There was a really sustained occupation at Chich, as well as out in the settlements around Gallon Jug as well. And if I could just go back for 1 second, kind of related to ceramics, but I wanted to also point out with some of these questions about community and specific locales and landscape, I think that those are really important for people living today. And in terms of engaging people in research, it's also important to answer questions that they're interested in. And so I think that is one avenue. Again, as Sylvia said, we're going to see a lot of papers in this symposium that address these issues of engagement. But I think that working in different time periods as well, and I'll point in for our project at Chich that Dr. Houk and a student have done historical archaeology at a settlement called Xunantunich. And, I think that people will find archaeology more relevant when they see themselves in it. I think Sylvia pointed that out as well. And one way to do that is to ask different questions about the past and to broaden our scope. And I think it's something that we're sort of trying to do at Chich, and is something that other projects are doing as well. So looking at the historic period a little bit more closely. I think at Gallon Jug, there's some really interesting opportunities for more historic archaeology and looking at, the material landscape of company towns, for example. So anyways, it ties a little bit to ceramics, but thanks for the question, Marie.
Can I add something really quickly? This might be just like the 3 cups of coffee that I drink and I'm just like about to rocket out of my chair. So this is going back to Aldair Vasquez's question and really about, have you tried to consider handing over Mayan artifacts to a Mayan descendants and see what he or she does in our information of the past? Well, one of the things that currently archaeologists are talking about is that through the process of archaeology, people are touching and asking questions about the artifacts just by in Belize, usually the people who excavate are local Belizeans. So they are, and typically they are of Maya descent, so they're also of African descent and so on. But they do ask questions. They do grab the ceramics. They do grab the materials. So they do have that first interaction with those materials, and they do ask questions. We know that and we're probably going to talk more about it in the symposium, that through the process of colonization, there's been a sort of separation between identities, between the Maya, and this is why a lot of people think that the Maya are gone, or 2012 and all that nonsense. So there's this disconnection with the cultural past and local communities. So one of the things that's really interesting, at least in my experience, is that through community outreach and giving, for example, when we went to the Casey Community School and we gave the kids those artifacts, we showed them, they do relate to them. They relate to them as ancient objects, but also in terms of, a lot of the objects that we find in Chich are everyday life objects, things for cutting, stone tools for cutting and cutting the grass or cutting other things or hammerstones or whistles and things like that. So there is a reconnection. There is a sort of like, oh yeah, I can see how people in the past in this area use this resources the same way that, it makes sense, so we are giving people, in a sense, they are interacting with the archaeological material. And I mean, I would like to think that archaeology is, in this sense, it's an important bridge that is allowing that reconnection. So being an archaeologist in this sense is incredibly important for, I mean, it's a big responsibility for uh local communities, and for the past, and how local communities see the past, and they can't and they how they see and want to interpret their own past. Anyway, that's the caffeine talking. Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much both for that. I think this sort of rounds up a lot of the sentiments that we have had and we've been exposed to with the Culture Symposium, and what you'll see in the chats, in that we organize these sessions acknowledging that many Belizeans that tune into the Culture Symposium don't really see an importance or a connection to archaeological research in Belize. And a lot of that is because there is sort of gaps in their understanding of how archaeological research is conducted, how it involves Belizeans, and how it sort of ties into our lived experiences of culture and our history and our heritage, and even the overall development of archaeological research in Belize. And so we, also want to acknowledge projects that are working within communities. And I think the mindsets of everyone here represented in this panel is very important. And Tomás, you speak of having it as a responsibility, and that you all are sort of these intermediaries almost in this journey of reconnecting with the past, and Claire mentioning that persons seeing themselves reflected in archaeology is how you make meaning with archaeology. And even the efforts to engage communities, whether directly or indirectly, or to engage communities by your participation in a symposium like this, I think is very, very important, and is to be acknowledged. And so I'd like to say thank you for that. But also, drawing attention to the Belize Institute of Archaeology, to the National Institute of Culture and History, to the Houses of Culture under Niche, to the Ministry of Education, and through the variety of other cultural practitioners, a lot of local community museums who are on the community side, leading the forefront to that level of engagement with archaeology, and how that ties into our lived experiences of our culture and our heritage as Belizeans. And I'm near the highway, so there's a lot of vehicles. But with that, thank you so much for your presentations. Thank you so much for this lively question and answer segment, for kicking off the Culture Symposium with us. And yes, thank you so much. Is there any last words before we move into the coffee break?
Just thank you for organizing this, and thank you for having us. This is great.
Thank you too. Follow everybody on social media. A bunch of information is out there and it's accessible. We will link all the projects, all the resources in the comments. Many of them are already in there. And yes, thank you so much. So to our viewers, we will take a 15-minute break and come back at 10:45. The live stream will not be interrupted. And when we come back from our coffee break, we will move into ancient Maya archaeology specific to Western Belize. All right, thank you so much, and see you in 15 minutes.
language, culture, heritage, and the arts from October 5th to the 7th. Make sure you're there.
All we know that you are there.
Were you on there October 5th to the 7th? Heritage Education Network Belize Culture Symposium, Community Issues and Innovative Practices. Make sure you join with our Facebook and YouTube. I want to there. You better be there.
Keeping up with language, culture, heritage, and the arts from October 5th to the 7th. Make sure you're there.
All we know that you are there.
Were you on there October 5th to the 7th? Heritage Education Network Belize Culture Symposium, Community Issues and Innovative Practices. Make sure you join with our Facebook and YouTube. I want to there. You better be there.
Hello, everyone. My co-authors and I would like to be.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to our second segment for this morning. Welcome back from the coffee break. We hope you managed to stretch your legs, get out of your chairs a little bit. If you didn't, we are sure that the music that you were hearing was keeping you energized and ready for more KULCHA discussions. I was mentioning to our co-directors that music makes me wants to move and talk Creole. And my other co-director said you should because it is KULCHA and it's a KULCHA symposium. So we would like to extend our thank you and our gratitude to Mr. Alexander Evans for composing the music for our symposium, specifically for us here at Heritage Education Network Belize. Thank you so much, Alexander Evans. We would like to also put out a quick reminder that we will have live question and answer segments with the presenters. So for our audience, for our viewers, please ask your question, whether that's on Facebook or on YouTube or WhatsApp us. That's been happening. We will get your questions and make sure we have them answered this morning. Just a reminder that Heritage Education Network Belize is volunteer-led, so if you enjoy this content, please consider donating to us so that we can make more events like this possible. Continuing on with archaeological research in Belize in our next segment, we move into Western Belize, and this is a region that is near and dear to my heart. This is where I started my archaeology career, so I'm excited to see all of these projects. But also the archaeology research projects mentioned here have been pivotal both to archaeological research in Belize and to my career. So this is a special spot for me. We had a high number of papers submitted this year from the Mopan Valley region, so Xunantunich area, Mopan Valley area, Sokots area. And so we absolutely had to make that into a thematic session. So I hope you all are tuned in and excited to hear about ceramics, about ancient Maya graffiti, and of course about socioeconomic perspectives. Opening up our second morning session is Ms. Alessandra Villarreal. Ms. Villarreal is a PhD candidate at the University of Texas at San Antonio. She studies Middle Preclassic ceramics from the Mopan River Valley, and the way that these materials highlight ancient social, political, and economic patterns. Her presentation titled Middle Preclassic Ceramic Distribution in Western Belize, a comparative study from early Xunantunich, highlights the social, ritual, and economic relationships between the site of San Lorenzo and Xunantunich that are materialized in the ceramic assemblages found. Please give a warm welcome to Ms. Alessandra Villarreal.
View of the Upper Belize River Valley during the Hello everyone. For this presentation, I will take a regional view of the Upper Belize River Valley during the Middle Preclassic through a very detailed look at one of the most common artifacts found in the Southern Maya lowlands, ceramics. Over this presentation, I highlight the value of a regional comparative approach when it comes to ceramic analysis. First, I'll describe the excavated assemblage from early Xunantunich, on which my current dissertation work is based. This collection is then compared to 3 others around the Upper Belize River Valley. By highlighting the similarities and differences across the collections, I will interpret the way that early Xunantunich was situated in this region during the Middle Preclassic period. The Upper Belize River Valley encompasses the Mopan and Macaw rivers to the west and their confluence in the Belize River flowing to the east. These major rivers acted as a thoroughfare of trade from the occupation of the Maya to all the way up into today as they crossed the modern political border with Guatemala. Today, though, I focus in on the movement of ceramic types, styles, and forms within the region. My regional focus starts in the west at Xunantunich and follows the Mopan and Belize rivers east to Barton Ramy. My focal collection is from the site of Xunantunich. Xunantunich boasted multiple monumental constructions by the Middle Preclassic period, if not earlier. Here I'm defining the Middle Preclassic as about 1200 or 1000 BCE all the way to 300 BCE. We know that sites with this kind of monumentality were often used for public gatherings and ritual events. Zooming a little further in, I focus on the site's Group E, also referred to as Early Xunantunich. This was the ritual center of the site during the Preclassic period before construction efforts shifted further up the hill to the Classic core, which we now know as Xunantunich today. Structure E2, highlighted here, has been a focus of excavations for the better part of a decade in the site's E group, a significant architectural style that is found across the Maya region. A centerline trench was excavated on the western face of E2 in order to better understand its construction phases. A large staircase was excavated from the thick marl fill in association with E2's second, or the second to last construction phase. As the upper portions of E2 second were removed, a set of 3 terraces were revealed, which you can see here and here. Sorry, here. These terraces formed the main body of structure E2 third, the third to last construction phase. Between 2016 and 2018, efforts were made to locate a central stairway on this phase. To this day, we have not located the stairs on this face of the building, which supports an idea that Dr. Brown has come up with, that the building was actually oriented to the east in earlier phases. With the first 2 construction phases, we encountered a hard-packed marl fill, which you can kind of see here and here especially. However, as we were excavating into those terraced walls, we uncovered layers of dry-laid cobble fill offset with stabilizing layers of wet-laid marl, which you can see here in this illustration. Within these cobbles, we discovered a rich collection of well-made, well-preserved ceramic sherds that were unlike the ones found in previous levels. So to set the scene for the rest of the just kind of the basics of what I found within that fill. I'll then highlight the forms and styles I commonly found to show you representative examples in order to frame the assemblage against the rest of the region that I bring up later. The most common types in this assemblage were the unslipped Hakote orange-brown, which is a utilitarian storage vessel, and the slipped Savannah orange and Reforma incised. These 2 types are within the Mars orange ware, which I'll talk about quite a lot. So, by and large, the Mars orange ware comprised the bulk of the assemblage, representing about 50%. This type was originally described by Gifford in the mid-70s and can be found across Western Belize. Some of the most common vessel shapes present in the collection are the flaring dish and what is known as a cuspidor, which is really a rounded flaring dish. These high-walled vessels are relatively small in diameter, usually less than 20 centimeters, suggesting that the vessels may have been for personal consumption rather than used as a large serving vessel or communal dish. Another shape that's fairly widespread in the Middle Preclassic is the globular form or globe-like form, including tecomates and chocolate pots. Both of these types have rounded shapes that are thought to resemble the native Crescentia cujete or tree gourd. Gourds may look recognizable and are still used for liquid and dry storage today, and may have been the inspiration for these early pots' shape. While tecomates are found across the Maya area and indeed across Mesoamerica in general, they're very specifically Middle Preclassic, falling out of style throughout the late Preclassic period. Chocolate pots as well are highlighted as indicators of ritual activity, and multiple pot fragments and spouts found at structure E2 suggest or drive home that early ritual significance of the site itself. And I want to point out in this slide as well as the previous one, that the paste or the internal material of some of these vessels that you can see here They stand out, especially to me. While many Mars orange varieties have well-sorted pastes where the size of clay particles and inclusions are more equally distributed, the density and hardness of these examples stand out. In the high-fired examples, almost no inclusions are visible, and the sherds themselves sound almost vitrified or glass-like. Now, that's not to say that the E2/3 assemblage did not show your classic Mars orange paste and form. Here's an example of those more classically described Mars orange pastes. Very well sorted still, but somewhat softer in texture, and they almost leave an orange film on your fingers when you touch them. We lovingly call that Cheeto dust. This paste is likely recognizable to most here, as this early type is nearly ubiquitous wherever middle preclassic occupation can be found. At least in Western Belize, I should say. An outlying pattern started to emerge as I studied E2/3 and its assemblage. There's a small group of vessels that had three common characteristics: a gray surface color, paste that's redder than its Mars orange counterpart, and an extremely well-sorted and high-fired paste. In other ways, the ceramics mimic the form and style of other Mars orange wares, seen not only at Xunantunich, but elsewhere in the region. I believe that these outlying gray vessels are an important piece in how we should situate early in the second half of my presentation, I'll follow the Mopan and Belize rivers towards the east, comparing assemblages from the three sites highlighted here. So let's start at the site of San Lorenzo, which is located just across the river from early Xunantunich. This site has a long history of occupation and ritual activity, with most of its visible structures dating to the Classic period. However, evidence of a middle preclassic choltun, first excavated by Jason Whitaker in 2014, has revealed an early occupation of the hinterland site. The choltun was quite literally chocked full of ceramic sherds, lithics, groundstone, as well as hute and apple snail shells. This assemblage is far less variable than that of early Xunantunich. It's comprised almost entirely of Mars orange and Houk orange brown, but there are a few earlier examples, like this fragment of a Cuneial colander. For the most part, though, it sits squarely in that middle preclassic ceramic complex known as Jenny Creek, which was defined by Gifford in the mid-70s. While the paste differs from the assemblage at early Xunantunich, you can see that the forms and stylistic decorations at both sites are really similar, especially this flaring dish and this incised tecomate here. There are some exceptions, like this everted dish in the middle. This vessel and other examples from the choltun all share lightning motifs incised on the inside of the vessel, which you can see here in this zigzag. This is a practice that likely tied to earlier uses of ceramic vessels at community ritual events. And this vessel that you see here is actually quite a bit larger than those flaring dishes and cuspidors that I explained earlier. Going further east, we come to KULCHA, a powerful center during the Middle Preclassic period. Plaza-B KULCHA has some of the earliest evidence of ceramic chronology in the region. This slide shows some of the earliest examples from KULCHA, which fall into the Cuneial complex, as well as a slightly later introduction of Reforma incised in the early Jenny Creek. Notice the coloration, decorative style, and forms of these vessels. Not only do these align with the samples across the E2/3 assemblage, but the pastes are that same well-sorted, high-fired quality that I've described. Finally, we're moving to the east, the easternmost site of Barton Ramy. Barton Ramy is a long-occupied site at which James Gifford actually conducted his ceramic analysis to create that regional chronology that we all use. In this region, of course. His original collection of sherds is housed at the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology at Harvard University in Boston, Massachusetts. I had the privilege of studying this collection for a short time in 2019 with a comparative perspective in mind. Again, we are seeing similar decorative styles as well as some familiar forms or shapes. but I really want to focus your attention on the pastes that you see here. These pastes have far more inclusions in them and are generally poorly sorted in terms of size of the inclusion itself. So you see multiple different sizes of inclusions just with the naked eye. The consistency of these pastes, therefore, were less dense and well preserved than other samples I've shown you so far. Now, I'm not arguing that the assemblage of Barton Ramey had any less skilled potters at their disposal. I believe that the differences and the similarities that we've seen so far come down to three factors: raw material, firing technique, and potter style. All of these are playing out in the types, shapes, and decorations that we see across the valley. Thinking back to all those pictures I just showed you, it should be clear that the forms and decorative motifs or decorative styles remain more or less consistent across the valley. And there are obviously examples of particularly ornate outliers at each site, but the bulk of the assemblage of fineware vessels have similar shapes and similar motifs. The most obvious difference then comes from the raw material and its treatment during production. Differences in paste texture can be attributed to accessibility of raw material, but it is in the washing and preparation of the raw clay that the grain sizes become more uniform, the clay more workable, and the eventual paste more dense. Similarly, the firing regimen will drastically change the texture and hardness of the ceramic, as well as the coloration of the surface. So I argue that these were not just passive results of raw material and temperature, what was direct results of potter's knowledge and intention for the vessel itself. These patterns we're seeing at early Xunantunich are a result of different potters' choices at the site that don't occur elsewhere in the valley. This might infer, therefore, that different potters are supplying early Xunantunich with vessels than the rest of the valley. One of the main reasons I argue for this unique set of potting traditions at or around early Xunantunich comes in part from the large number of dark sherds found within the cobble fill. These hard-fired red paste sherds with dark surfaces have been classified as Savannah and Reforma because of their shapes and decorations are so similar to the regionally defined type. But I argue that these sherds potentially represent a potter, a group of potters who were trying to emulate Mars orange with different choices made at critical production stages. I argue further that this was an intentional choice. I don't believe, for example, that this gray patterning is an accidental fire cloud, as the pattern occurs across multiple vessels. So where does this leave us? If we compare the assemblage from across the valley, we see changes that I believe reflect slight chronological changes, as well as changes in potter's choice. So some of the earliest examples from Kalpech, like Mo modeled and Kitam incised, which we see here, may have served as the precursors to the later iterations of Savannah Orange and Reforma incised, respectively. Over time, the choices of potters across the valley became more widespread, and form, style, and composition tended to homogenize with the spread of types like Juventud Red and later even Sierra Red. I believe that this places the potters, wares, and activities at early Xunantunich in a critical transitional period, chronologically between the types of ceramics that we're seeing, those early ceramics that we're seeing at Kalpech, and the later, more widespread types that we see across the valley. Further chemical and mineralogical studies will confirm or reject this hypothesis, of course, but I think that the formal and typological patterns that I've shown here suggest some interesting relationships between major sites in the valley. And this is a pattern I hope to continue to tease apart in my dissertation work. So with that, I want to say thank you. Thank you to my collaborators and especially to the coordinators of this wonderful KULCHA symposium.
Thank you very much for that presentation, Ali, and thank you very much for your acknowledgement of David in your presentation. Continuing on with our presentations of ancient Maya archaeology in Western Belize, we now move on to that of Dr. Kathryn Brown. Dr. Kathryn Brown is the Dr. Brown endowed professor of anthropology at the University of Texas at San Antonio. Her research focuses on the rise of the Maya civilization. She examines the role of ritual and religion in ancient Maya communities. She directs the Mopan Valley Preclassic project, and her team is currently investigating the sites of Xunantunich and Las Ruinas de Arenal. This presentation, Documenting Ancient Maya Graffiti, a case study from Xunantunich, focuses on new evidence of graffiti from the El Castillo Acropolis at Xunantunich. Dr. Kathryn Brown.
Thanking the organizers of the KULCHA conference. In this paper, we highlight new evidence from the Maya site of Xunantunich, which we believe may shed light on the function of ancient Maya graffiti in certain contexts. We also discuss the importance of detailed and accurate recording of graffiti in the archaeological record. As we all know, once plaster surfaces are exposed to the elements, there is a danger of loss of preservation. My co-authors and I would like to begin by thanking the organizers of the KULCHA conference. In this paper, we highlight new evidence from the Maya, which we believe may shed light on the function of ancient Maya graffiti in certain contexts. We also discuss the importance of detailed and accurate recording of graffiti in the archaeological record. As we all know, once plaster surfaces are exposed to the elements, there is a danger of loss of preservation. Thus, we highlight the methods that we use to document a large corpus of graffiti, several hundred images that we uncovered at structure A5 second at El Castillo. Although ancient Maya graffiti has been documented at a number of sites in the Maya lowlands, our understanding of the function of this art form remains relatively limited. I would like to say that there have been some very interesting recent studies of graffiti, including by Bivar at the Xunantunich Palace, that has really moved forward our interpretations of this important form of art by the ancient Maya. Graffiti, however, is often still set apart from more formal forms of Maya art due to its seemingly simplistic nature. Early interpretations of graffiti focus mostly on the unrefined nature of the designs. In a 1978 study of graffiti at Tikal, Michael Kempen states, on every stage of conception and execution, the graffiti appeared to lack the logical and organized principles of construction characterizing other varieties of Maya art. In 1954, Sir J. Eric S. Thompson suggested that graffiti was the result of doodling by bored or inattentive novices. He also suggested that maybe this was the result of Maya novices before an initiation ceremony. We do think that it's important to note that Thompson, in his analysis of graffiti and the crudeness of the designs, attributed this to Maya novices. Now, following along those same similar lines of interpretation, Scott Hudson, in a 2011 Latin American Antiquity article, focuses on the possibility that the interpreted crudeness of graffiti derives from the youth of its creators and therefore lack of training. He suggests that many examples of graffiti were created by ancient Maya children, and we agree with him on this interpretation. He also suggests that there is evidence of different skill levels present on some walls, suggesting a possible dialogue between different artists. And this particular suggestion resonates with our own interpretations of the data set from Xunantunich at El Castillo, as we believe that in some cases, the dialogue between different artists may in fact be related to instruction. And we're not suggesting all graffiti is related to instruction, but in certain contexts and certain situations, it may be. Our investigations at El Castillo, a 39-meter tall acropolis right here in the center, uncovered a late classic building, structure A5 second, on the east side of El Castillo that housed 3 south-facing rooms. There's an overview showing where those rooms were located. A small private stairway provided access to these rooms, suggesting a special function. Here you can see a reconstruction drawing by Leah McCurdy that illustrates the architecture of El Castillo during this particular time period. Our excavation team, directed by Leah McCurdy and led by Ronaldo Chich, excavated the eastern and central rooms of this building. The interior and exterior walls of the 2 rooms were covered with incised images and designs, ranging from simple sketches, which are referred to as graffiti, to actually more formal renderings. A good example of one of these formal renderings is a chalk sheep chalk that was found in the eastern room. This was first identified and drawn by Christoph Hilmke. And here you can see that this was incised on its side, but when it's flipped 90 degrees, it is a great example of a rendered chalk sheep chalk. Other images included sacred symbols, glyphs, animals, sages, warriors, ball players, architectures, as well as sacrificial scenes and bloodletting. And in fact, all sorts of images were incised on the rooms and the walls and the benches of the rooms. In several previous papers, we've suggested that this building was a special place where ancient Maya noble children were instructed in the arts and sacred knowledge. Of importance to our interpretation, we encountered an incised glyph that reads Itzat, translated as wise man or sage. You can see the glyph here and the drawing of the glyph by Christoph Hilmke. Moreover, there are several images of scribal personages incised into the plaster walls, including a beautifully rendered seated scribe on the north wall of the eastern room. If you pair this with the Itzat glyph, the title might be referring to an individual such as this seated scribe. Further supporting our idea of instruction, several of the walls were partitioned into sections and numerous images were repeated as if the designs were practiced. An excellent example of this practice is a series of monkeys that were incised on the west door jamb of the central room. This image is drawn by my co-author, Lauren Nowakowski. Note that one of the monkeys appears to be a model, the one where the green arrow is pointing right here, or an example for different artists to follow. Here you can clearly see the different skill levels present. Additionally, many of the images in the eastern room were marked with a gouged X across the face. We've interpreted this as possible assessment, although there are many other interpretations, maybe as desecration here, but it does seem to be that these X's are doing something with the images that have been practiced. So we're suggesting possible assessment. Using the analogy of the Aztec Calmacac, or the school for young Aztec nobles, it seems likely that the ancient Maya also had schools where noble adolescents were trained in religion, sacred knowledge, arts, and military strategies. Thus, taken together, gridded wall space, evidence of practice through repetition, possible assessment, and evidence of various skill levels within the rooms discovered at El Castillo, we believe that this points towards a space for specialized instruction. In a broader context, a private stairway leads from the landing of these rooms to a series of terraces on the eastern side of El Castillo, as you can see here. We believe that these terraces provided access to Group C just to the south of the Acropolis. This unusual group contains two vaulted structures facing each other across a very small courtyard. Both of these structures consist of a line of rooms with high benches, each with its own doorway. Excavations have revealed incised patoli boards and a few graffiti elements incised into the benches of all rooms that have been investigated to date. Additionally, excavations have revealed very few domestic artifacts associated with these buildings, and preliminary ceramic analysis suggests that the assemblage is dominated by serving vessels. Furthermore, the two buildings are associated with a sweat bath located right here, supporting the notion that this group had a special function. We believe that these buildings could represent the temporary living quarters for young nobles who are being instructed within special rooms at El Castillo. And here are some excavation shots of our rooms showing the doorways and high benches, and here the high bench with the incised patoli board. Now that I've provided a brief overview of our findings and interpretations of the graffiti from structure 5 we like the methods that we use to document the walls and door jambs. I think it is important to note that due to the unusual nature of this building and its protected location on the east side of El Castillo, we were given permission by the Institute of Archaeology to leave the excavated rooms open for several years, allowing a longer time frame for study. In typical in a typical situation, you would have to excavate the rooms, document the graffiti, and then backfill the rooms in short order. So in consultation with Mr. Jorge Khan of the IA, Ronaldo Tut and our excavation team built a protective roof over the rooms, as well as a fence and a doorway to secure the location from any potential vandalism. The eastern room was first excavated in 2016, and the central room was fully exposed in 2018. The roof and fence at the location are maintained to make sure the plaster walls in the rooms are protected. Additionally, the plaster surfaces are cleaned each year using alcohol and soft cotton pads to remove any mold growth. The surfaces remain in excellent condition with only minor changes since the original exposure. For recording purposes, we applied a multi-method approach to documentation for several reasons. First and foremost, we wanted to record the graffiti as accurately as possible, including thinly incised elements that might not be visible with the naked eye. Second, due to our unusual circumstances allowing for an extended study, we realized that structure A52 presented a unique opportunity to examine best practices for graffiti documentation in variable situations. Third, we wanted to record any preservation loss that may occur from exposure over a period of years. As you can imagine, the hundreds of graffiti elements incised into the dark interior spaces of the rooms presented a challenge for hand recording in a timely fashion. Headlamps and flashlights were, of course, useful, but we needed more light to fully map the large corpus of graffiti. Bringing a small generator up the steps of El Castillo was a possibility, but the noise and gas fumes would have likely impacted visitors' experience at the site. So we opted for a simpler solution using a more portable car battery with a converter to plug in desk lamps. This worked well. However, the battery would often run out of charge by the end of the day. Thus, intensive mapping occurred during the first half of the day in the field. The car battery was then charged overnight and then returned to the site each morning. Hand mapping of the graffiti elements is a very time-consuming endeavor. For example, in 2016, Lee McCurdy and her team were able to hand map approximately 75 graffiti elements in about a 2-week period. This would be very difficult if you were excavating the rooms in the same season and trying to document everything. In 2017 and in 2018, Liam continued both hand mapping, and then she experimented with tracing images onto Mylar. For photo documentation, my co-author Neil Dixon used the technique of reflective transformation imaging, or RTI. RTI photography is a computational photographic technique building upon polynomial texture mapping. Essentially, RTI captures images where the light position is changed each time in an equidistant hemisphere over a surface. Due to the dynamic nature of RTI photos and the capture of light from multiple angles and positions, the RTI surfaces have better lighting and texture than is visible on site. Often poor illumination on site hides details which become clear when viewing an RTI processed image. Thus, thinly incised lines that are not always visible to the naked eye can be observed through this technique. Neil conducted RTI on the plaster surfaces in 2016 and 2017, as well as 2018, to ensure complete coverage as well as track changes in preservation. This past summer, my co-author Nowakowski returned to Structure A57 to conduct a detailed study on best practices of recording graffiti under variable circumstances. This research is the basis for her master's thesis. She performed timed hand mapping and Mylar tracing exercises within both the eastern and western rooms. On the exterior wall between the two rooms, a string grid was set up to allow Lauren to fully hand map all graffiti elements in context. Note that the string grid was only attached in the walls in areas where plaster was not preserved in order to not damage any intact plaster. Once the grid was set up, a map of the entire wall was produced fairly quickly in about 3 hours. This larger map depicted where individual elements were located in relation to each other. And once this was completed, Lauren was able to then carefully hand map individual images on a 1-to-1 scale and then place them within the broader context of the same wall. Lauren also plans to perform a timed study, drawing study from the RTI data set as a comparison to hand mapping and tracing on Mylar. Her master's thesis will provide a roadmap for best methods to use in differential circumstances, although we strongly advocate for multiple methods if time and resources permit. Our future plans at Structure A52 include the possibility of excavating the Western Room. However, logistics and funding for this endeavor may prove challenging. The room is extremely deeply buried, and it will be really hard to get to. We also plan to conduct another full RTI of both rooms in 2023 to record any further loss of preservation due to exposure. In the coming year, it will be necessary to backfill the rooms for stability purposes. So we hope to finalize any additional analysis within the rooms, including plaster studies by 2025. Finally, our project hopes to create opportunities for visitors and school children of Belize to engage with the amazing graffiti images discovered within the structure A5 second rooms. And we would like to provide some type of a reconstruction or a model of this through a display at the site. In closing, I'd like to thank the Institute of Archaeology for allowing us to conduct this important research. And I'd like to also acknowledge our funding agencies with a special shout out to Alphawood Foundation, who has supported multiple years of this research. Thank you.
Thank you for that presentation, Dr. Brown. Closing our morning session is Dr. Rebecca Friedel-Juan with her presentation titled Ancient Maya Transformations in the Mopan River Valley, a Socio-Ecological Perspective. After working with the Mopan Valley Archaeology and Preclassic projects in Western Belize for 9 years, Rebecca received her PhD in anthropology from the University of Texas at San Antonio in 2021. Her research has focused on the complex dynamics between societies and their environments in the Mopan River Valley of Belize through the lens of human-plant relationships. She is one of the directors at Heritage Education Network Belize and is currently a postdoctoral researcher at El Colegio de la Frontera Sur, Chetumal, Mexico. She is passionate about breaking boundaries to knowledge and education, having worked at various institutions of higher education, including Gillen University and the University of Belize, and is engaged with many communities in Belize. We welcome Dr. Rebecca Friedel-Juan, our co-director.
For being here today. Also, a special thank you to the KULCHA organizers, Henby family, and to my fellow presenters. My name is Rebecca Friedel-Juan, and today I will present some of my dissertation research, which reconstructed a socio-ecological history of human-plant relationships in the Mopan River Valley of modern-day Belize. You can see the study region here on this map, and ancient Maya occupation. I'll focus solely here on the major conclusions arrived at by my research, but if anyone is interested in the details, my dissertation is free to access via ProQuest, or you can email me for it. As an overview, I'll start by reviewing some of the major ideas surrounding ancient Maya transformations and how they've been conceptualized by scholars and the broader public. I'll then present how I have conceptualized these same transformations through the framing of resilience thinking, which aims to understand what causes some systems to quote-unquote collapse and others to remain resilient in the face of major changes, such as droughts, famine, or other major socio-ecological upheavals. I'll then discuss how I use this framework of resilience thinking to make sense of a history of human-plant relationships. In particular, I will situate these ideas within a broader socio-political history of my study region, the Mopan River Valley of modern-day Western Belize. I'll then conclude with a brief overview of my major conclusions. In general, the history of ancient Maya society in this region has been conceptualized using these four major concepts, highlighting the changing or transformative nature of the culture through time. First, ancient Maya society during the Preclassic period has been theorized through the lens of a rise in complexity. This is when most of the population occupying the Maya region began to settle on the landscape. They started manipulating the forests through agricultural production and constructing larger and larger buildings for public gatherings and rituals and ultimately elite use. Following this diverse and dynamic period of settling on the landscape through various cultural practices in the region, the ancient Maya are well known for their classic period florescence, where there was a focus on accumulating wealth at specific political centers across the Maya region. This is when we see the widespread use of hieroglyphic writing and elaboration in art and architecture, and the solidification of an elite and commoner divide in social classes. There's also clear evidence for warfare and alliance building with outside and internal polities, with victories and losses being commemorated on stela that have been erected at major sites throughout the area. This continued accumulation of wealth and power at political centers did not last forever for all of them, however, as we see an eventual decline and ultimate abandonment of many of the major centers, particularly central lowlands during the terminal classic period. This, as I'm sure many of you have heard, has come to be called the ancient Maya collapse, which often gets misinterpreted as a sweeping notion that the people who once inhabited all of this area disappeared and left the region barren. This misinterpretation is just that, misinformed and misleading. Instead, we understand that ancient societies, the Maya included, constantly changed and shifted in their social, political, and ecological relationships, with some political centers falling into disuse by the end of the terminal classic, but others continued to flourish up until the arrival of Europeans. For the latter, you can tune in on Friday to hear various presentations about the resilience and longevity of Lamani, also right here in Belize. This period, following the disintegration of several previously dominant political centers in the region, has been conceptualized as a reorganization in both general population movement as well as power shifts to different political centers, mostly as a shift to the northern Yucatan region. But as I mentioned, there are several sites, including Lamani, in the southern lowlands that continue to prosper. These four major transformations of broader Maya society are what have informed my investigations of a history of human-plant relationships in the Mopan River Valley of Belize, and how such relationships may have played a role in these socio-political dynamics as they played out in this specific area. Specifically for my research, I wanted to know what was different about each of these time periods in regards to the ways people interacted with and managed plants on the landscape that may have played a role in how these socio-political dynamics played out. To investigate, I conceptualized the Mopan River Valley as a socio-ecological system, which understands that humans are only one part of a broader system that also includes non-human entities such as plants. Essentially, in systems, we understand that humans will impact the plants, while the plants will also then impact the humans in what we call continuous feedback loops. Diversity is a term you've probably heard repeatedly in various contexts and made most popular in relation to biodiversity in studies of biology and ecology. There are many ways to measure diversity within any given context, but generally most scholars agree that any measure of higher diversity. Similarly, within systems thinking, there is a central notion that diversity is important for maintaining a resilient system so that it can continue to function through any major shock to the system, like drought, famine, or other socio-ecological disaster. Essentially, the more taxa of plants present on the landscape, the more likely that there will be any species with a function or response able to adapt to any given change, and then maintain the overall functioning of the system to prevent a collapse or what we call a release. Following these ideas, I suggested that the ways humans interact with plants could play a major role in whether the broader system maintained resilience. So if the populations of the Mopan River Valley interacted with plants in such a way to diminish their overall diversity through time, this could have introduced major vulnerabilities to the system, causing it not to be able to adapt to major changes, namely a series of droughts which we know occurred in the Maya region at the end of the late Classic and into the terminal Classic periods. So now that I've laid out my theoretical approach to investigating the ancient Maya, I'll give a brief history of the specific region I studied to contextualize things before I present my ultimate results. Based on over a century of work in the area, I was able to construct a complex adaptive cycle model for the ancient Mopan River Valley socio-ecological system to be able to test my hypothesis regarding the role of plant diversity in its resilience dynamics and potential vulnerabilities. This is a lot of data, so I apologize for the text-heavy slide. As I mentioned, it's over a century worth of work, but bear with me. Generally, the initial occupation phase for the Mopan River Valley correlates with the late Archaic up to the beginning of the Middle Preclassic period. This was when human populations were first entering the area and experimenting with its various resources. During this phase, research has documented various ecozones being utilized and eventually settled from low-lying river valleys to hilltop bluffs. As data for this general period is limited in the Mopan River Valley, some evidence for this part of the model comes from broader Belize River Valley and the transition between the exploitation and conservation phases. Notably, from the site of Chan, just at the periphery of the Mopan River Valley, Agricultural terracing and water management systems have been documented by Dr. Andrew Wyatt as being established as early as the Middle Preclassic. Furthermore, a Middle Preclassic Chultun at Calpech was investigated by Dr. Terry Powis and colleagues, revealing resources obtained from a diversity of habitats and through a diversity of strategies, including a variety of domesticated and wild plants, as well as both local and imported terrestrial, avian, and marine fauna. These all suggest a diversity of resource acquisition strategies were being utilized during this early period. Transitioning into the conservation phase, which likely began also during the Middle Preclassic, is when we see the first major architectural investment in monumental centers at the Mopan River Valley at the site of early Xunantunich. These centers of accumulating wealth shift to various locales throughout the valley, including Octun Khan during the terminal Preclassic, then Buena Vista del Cayo during the early Classic, and finally Xunantunich during the late Classic. Notably, investigations into the region's precipitation dynamics show that droughts occurred during Octun Khan's prowess in the terminal Preclassic, but no broader system collapse occurs. Instead, we see that population size continues to grow and wealth continues to accumulate at these polycenters in the sequence as I just described. Other data for this period regarding human-environment interactions largely comes from the end of it, during the end of the late Classic. Specifically, research by Neff and colleagues suggests that the landscape was dominated by agricultural terracing and a substantial hinterland population by the end of the late Classic. Their research documented an average of 138 agricultural terraces per square kilometer, supporting a population that peaked at 524 people per square kilometer. Isotopic work on classic fauna by Dr. Carolyn Freiwald and colleagues shows that the majority of wild game was being obtained from habitats outside of the Mopan River Valley. So of these few that were obtained locally, though, isotopic signatures showed that their diets were majority C4 plants. This just means herbaceous taxa, probably largely maize. So this suggests that the landscape was probably deforested and these deer were eating herbaceous plants instead of more leafy foliage. Also of relevance here, and colleagues investigating macrobotanical remains from various sites throughout the region, ultimately concluding that late Classic elites likely situated at Xunantunich had restricted the broader population's access to imported pine wood, making it a commodity by the end of the late Classic. Climate research, as I mentioned, shows that under the period of sociopolitical fluorescence at these various sites, the region saw multiple droughts. These terminal Classic droughts, unlike the ones during the terminal Preclassic, correspond with a release phase or sociopolitical collapse during this time. This has been documented with population declines at some sites as high as 60%. We also see the failure of elites at Xunantunich to control any substantial labor for continuous accumulation of wealth at the site, with no major architectural projects being completed. The following reorganization period during the post-Classic shows a substantial reduction in population, with estimates revealing occupation frequencies of 0%. While this is a noteworthy reduction, more recent investigations have identified some post-Classic ceramics at the residential structures within the region, as well as some abandoned political centers, likely indicating veneration of the past socio-political landscapes, as well as much smaller yet continued occupation in the valley. The reorganization phase for the region is generally poorly understood, but it has been accepted that some smaller populations remained with a very different political organization, likely focused on more local networks. Knowing this general socio-political history, which, as I mentioned, was informed by over a century of research in the area, has allowed me to ask some questions about the past that traditionally may not have been asked without such immense background data. Namely, how did people on the past utilize and manage plants on the landscape, and how did these practices relate to broader socio-political and climatic trends, if at all? To answer these questions, I took an interdisciplinary approach by combining methods and theories from a broad number of disciplines, like paleoecology, botany, archaeology, geology, palynology, and anthropology. This entailed collecting cores of sediments from the bottom of a small body of water in the village of Cala Creek, that I then conducted various analyses on, including the isolation and identification of pollen spores in various layers of the cores to understand what kinds of plant taxa were present on the landscape through time. I was then able to ask questions about the nature of these data in relation to the already known sociopolitical and climatic dynamics that I just described. Through these data, I was able to show that a steady decrease in plant diversity on the landscape over time led to the lowest diversity seen by the terminal classic period. This ultimately supported the hypothesis that low plant diversity was an indicator of vulnerabilities in the system that may have aided in the sociopolitical collapse that we know occurred in the valley. Such vulnerabilities caused by low plant diversity on the landscape when combined with long periods of intense drought could be low land albedo or high solar heat retention in the landscape, poor soil permeability, and ultimately poor crop harvests. Based on these data, plus several other supplementary data sets, I investigated what may have caused this low plant diversity and what kinds of plants were actually being favored on the landscape. This last hypothesis I tested through various means. First, I looked at the types of plant taxa indicated by the pollen, which could give me an idea if the landscape was largely forested or dominated by herbaceous species through time. Secondly, I reconstructed the amount of biomass burned on the landscape through time through quantifying the amount of charcoal present in the same sediment cores that the pollen was extracted. This helped me to understand the potential amount of slash and burn agriculture and general wood burning that was being done locally, which equates to levels of deforestation. Lastly, I investigated the types of plants utilized within a hinterland community center through time to see if the plants that local community members favored shifted through time as well, and what taxa may indicate about the local system. Ultimately, this continuous reduction in diversity of plants on the landscape correlates with a steady increase in biomass burning on the landscape until the middle of the late Classic, when it decreases dramatically. This could indicate one of two things: that the local inhabitants suddenly shifted their landscape management style, or that the trend of high biomass burning through time had deforested the landscape, leaving it with less biomass to burn due to the lack of time for regeneration between harvest cycles. Based on the types of plants identified in the pollen, it was likely the latter, due to a lack of forest habitat species or deforested habitat species. As you can see on the figure pictured, the diversity of macrobotanical remains, or plants utilized within the community center, actually increased during the terminal Classic. When looking at what kinds of plants these were, we actually see that pinewood is the dominant, if not only, species being utilized here up until the terminal Classic, when it is completely absent and instead is replaced by a diversity of more local and disturbance indicating taxa like palmwood. These data support the previously discussed hypothesis by Dr. David Lentz and colleagues that the local elites situated at Xunantunich had previously controlled the importation of pine timber by the late Classic period. It's likely that the imported pine wood held some ideological significance given its longevity of use at the community center, which the elites may have taken advantage of by controlling the distribution of, perhaps for profit. This importance given to imported timber products may have caused for the local communities to overlook the value of local timber products through time. Ultimately, with the collapse of Xunantunich's socio-political power, we see the local communities resorting to historically less desired but locally available alternatives. These are only some of the major conclusions arrived at by my research, and I could go on for quite a bit longer, but in the interest of time, I will end there. So I have an abundance of people and entities to thank, only some of which are shown here, including the funding agencies that made this research possible, like NSF, LACOR, and UTSA, as well as the research support from these entities plus that of ICOSOR. And of course, I need to thank my many collaborators at MVAP and MVPP, as well as the HENBI and Fahina families for all of their support throughout the years. Finally, I want to thank you all again for watching my presentation, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that presentation, Dr. Rebecca Fidel Juan. And thank you for wrapping up our morning segment. We are 1 minute ahead of time and ahead of schedule. So no Belizean time on this end for our culture symposium. I will now bring on stream our presenters. So we will have Dr. Rebecca Fidel Juan joining us, soon to be, crossing fingers for you, Dr. Alessandra Villarreal and Dr. Kathryn Brown. Welcome, ladies. There's a lot of women energy on this the symposium this morning. I keep saying the future of archaeology is females, and that is a shift from the past. So welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much for your presentations and for being an integral part of our day one of our culture symposium. We will jump right into the questions so that we can keep on track and make it to lunchtime with our question and answers segment completed. So our first question is for Dr. Brown, and it reads, and this is from Karina again. Thank you for joining us and for being engaged, Karina. It reads, how do you differentiate between graffiti and important Maya writing? Is graffiti also found at all Maya sites?
Hi there. That's a great question. I think it's a really important question as well. Typically, when you have hieroglyphic writing, it's often incised in a more meaningful way, either you have it on ceramic vessels, you have it on carved stela, or in painted mural programs, and that it's more related, I guess, in most cases to the history of certain events that might be happening, where graffiti seems to be something that we see at a number of different sites. So it is found at, we don't know, it hasn't been documented at all Maya sites, but it has been documented at a large number of Maya sites across the Maya lowlands. But it seems to be a little bit more informal, oftentimes, like haphazardly placed on walls and benches in different areas. I think what makes the graffiti unique in structure A5 second is there does appear to be a dialogue between the different elements, and there's practice with intention and repetition. So something seems to be happening there that may indicate instruction. But thank you so much for that great question.
Wonderful. Yes, great question. Dr. Brown, if you could allow me to add a little bit, could you comment on maybe other sites where graffiti has been discovered, maybe in Belize or within the Maya area?
Oh, yes. In fact, Dr. Brett Houk and his team have excavated a number of rooms that had graffiti at the Maya site at Chich, and they even mentioned the Patoli boards, the games in their presentation, and oftentimes the Patoli boards are incised on benches. At El Castillo and Structure A5 second, we actually have a graffiti element of a small representation of a Batoli board. So I think that's interesting that they're, doing that. But also at like sites like Tikal, you can wander through some of the structures today and still see the ancient Maya graffiti in the walls. There's other graffiti at Xunantunich in the palace that Bivar has documented. And then oftentimes there's just, there may be like 4 or 5 graffiti images or elements in a particular room, which I think is what makes this assemblage a little bit more interesting in some way, because there's hundreds of images on these walls and benches. But yes, they've been found even in the northern Maya lowlands. So
hundreds of images at Xunantunich. So in terms of numbers within one room, that makes it unique. Wonderful. Thank you very much, Dr. Brown. We have a couple questions for Ali. So we'll go ahead through the first ones. The first question is from Alyssa, and it says, what decorative surface techniques was used by the potters, and did this technique change based on where they were found? Is this practice still used today?
Hi, thanks for that question. It's a great question. There are different techniques that are used and different tools that are used. If that's the question you're getting at, is there are different tools. So, and you can actually see that if you look really closely at some of the incised lines on the outside. So they would use things like reeds, sticks, even like bone tools to carve into the outside. And they could do this right before they fired it. So when it's a little soft, or even after they fire it when it's already hard. And those are things that you can tell if you look really closely at the outside surface. Um, as a In terms of the decoration style, there's different styles across the region and even within one site. And so that's what I'm looking at to kind of look at potters, because everybody kind of has a style that they stick to. But that can change regionally. So just the way that they're even applying these lines on. I don't know if you saw in my presentation, there were some that were a little bit wonky, we'll say. And of course, we can't put judgment onto whether straight lines are the best, right? But there's some that are definitely a little, curvy. And so we think about that in terms of learning these processes too. But those kinds of techniques are still used today by modern potters, who I think we'll hear from either a little bit later today or tomorrow. And some of the potters that I've worked with as well, they still use these kinds of techniques.
Thank you very much for that reply. Some of them have a little bit more personality than others, Ali.
That's a perfect way to put it.
But also, I think those are some of the techniques that can also be seen in the incisions for the graffiti as well. So a lot of, your handiness, if you're left-handed, right-handed, but also your level of learning displayed in these techniques, and identifying ways in which you can bring some of that is evident in the material record to the forefront. Wonderful. Thank you. There is another question for you, Ali, and this comes from April. Our HENB co-directors are in the chats and they're geeking out because it's archaeology. So April asks, do you think these data suggest that there was enough common forms and techniques to suggest a common regional school for teaching potters how to create pots in this early time period?
So this, that's a great question as well. Thank you, April. This is a great way to kind of tie into Dr. Brown's talk as well, talking about schools of learning and things like that. I think in this early period, in the middle pre-classic, we don't have that kind of like centralized control over what people are making. I think rather you would think about it as more of a style that's kind of in vogue at the time, right? So rather than there being central control over how people are producing things, at least in this period, in this early time, think of it rather as maybe those motifs are really popular, or they're doing something or conveying a certain kind of information, but they're not necessarily top down taught. Now, you do obviously have expert artisans and things who are going to be teaching their next generation of artists but that's probably more local. So it could be like family or something like that. It's a little bit hard to get at that archaeologically. I'm hoping my dissertation talks about that by using NEA to see kind of where they're sourcing certain pottery. But later, so once you get into the classic period, where you have more centralized control of a lot of different aspects of life, you do start to see schools where you start to see epigraphy, so writing on pottery. That's when you start to really see those schools of art, which we also see in writing on buildings and things like that, and what is possibly going on at Xunan in the Castillo with those learning techniques. But that's of course much later. So I think timing wise with what I'm working on, it's not as centralized yet.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that, Ali. We move on to a question for Dr. Rebecca Fidel-Juan, and this is from James Bacon. He asks, are there plants that do not survive well or at all in the archaeological record, and how do you adjust for these absences, these quotes unquote invisible plants?
Thank you for that great question, Mr. Bacon. And yes, there are actually a lot of plants that don't survive well in the archaeological record, particularly here in the Maya region, because it's very wet and humid. Most plants would degrade or decompose, right? So we're really depending mostly on carbonized plant remains, at least in a macrobotanical form. So things like seeds and wood, these things have been burned in some way, and so then they preserve in the archaeological record. But there are ways to get at some of these quote unquote invisible plants, typically things that we consider microbotanical analyses. So looking at the pollen, like I presented in my presentation, gives you an idea of plants that we may not have access to otherwise. There's also starch grain analysis or phytolith analysis that also really helps get at these invisible plants. There's actually some great work that's been done looking at the starch grains and phytolith grains on particular artifacts. And we are able to get at things like tubers, which we cannot find actually preserved in the archaeological record in any form besides this microbotanical method, right? So yeah, it's a methodological issue, but with science, we're able to get new and new methodologies that are able to identify and look at some of these plant remains.
Wonderful. Thank you for that, Becca. And I think also talking about sort of these invisible plants in the archaeological record, also in relation to the type of tools that the Maya would have used, because we think a lot of stone tools, but there is all of those wood and plant and gourds and all of those elements that have not preserved. And so our understanding of ancient Maya tool use and is really centered around ceramics and stone tools, because there's that absence of those invisible plants. So wonderful. Thank you for that, James.
Could I add, sorry, one more thing? We also, it's not utilized as much, but I would say that we also use iconography and art to try to understand the plants from the past. And there are some contexts that we do get wood and these organic remains preserved, like caves, for example. There's this really beautiful mirror bearer that was probably found in a cave context. Unfortunately, I think it was taken by looters, so we don't know exactly the context of it, but it's wood and it's probably over 1,000 years old, and it's beautiful, and we actually have a representation of a very specific, the same style mirror bearer depicted in a mural, for example. So we know that those kinds of things that are represented in the artwork would have been actually physically present in the past. But they would have been actually physically present in the past. They aren't just depicted in the artwork, right? So, so we are able to get a sense of some of these more organic, invisible plants in that sense.
Thank you for that, Becca, and I apologize for being so close to the highway, but there are a lot of big trucks. But thank you very much to Galen University for allowing me time off to host a symposium from my office here. So there are some compromises that must be made. So there are a lot of really great questions in the comments area. So I'm thinking maybe we extend our question and answer segment a little bit to just accommodate some of them. And if we cannot get to all of these questions, and I'm sure that the researchers here would be happy to answer these questions. If you reach out to them, they can leave their email addresses in there. So I'll pull some of the more relevant, well, not more relevant, I'm sorry, I misspoke. Some of the ones that can be applied to all of the presenters and that align a little bit more with our KULCHA Symposium team. Not relevant, I apologize for that. I'll pull this one from Botanical Y. It's one of our YouTube comments. So this is a two-part question, and it reads, for all the presenters, how is ancient defined in archaeology? Do you believe there is any implicit neocolonial sentiment regarding what is classified as ancient versus what is not? He continues to say, especially considering vast chronological differences in when different cultures and societies are defined as ancient. Becca, I nominate you.
Yes, in the short answer, yes, there is neocolonial sentiments implicit in our use of these terms. Unfortunately, as most scientific disciplines have, anthropology and archaeology in general have some colonial roots, and our use of some terms is a little bit problematic, right? But I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Sylvia, but the official term ancient in archaeology is anything that's over 50 years old, right? At least it is in the United States. I don't know if in Belize it's the same.
In Belize, it's over 100 years old.
Over 100. Okay. But certainly, when we're talking about ancient Maya, we're trying to differentiate from the historical Maya as well as the modern Maya. But of course, there's continuity there, and Maya in and of itself is a problematic term because it was applied to this broad region, and it wasn't actually used by all of the individuals in the region personally, right? That it's referring to. So there's definitely some colonial roots in this terminology, but unfortunately we're sort of stuck with them as a discipline, and we just have to slowly try to figure out better ways to communicate about them.
And I think these are some of the areas that Belize is trying to address, as a whole. So when we look at this curricular reform that is being proposed by the Ministry of Education and identifying Belizean studies as a area for cross-curricular learning across, multiple subject areas. When you look at the learning outcomes within and those areas of instruction within, the Belizean studies curriculum, and how it speaks to those questions of national identity, of cultural expression, of heritage, of access to heritage spaces. When you look at the recent efforts to decolonize our society, the acknowledgement and celebration of Emancipation Day, the acknowledgement and celebration of Indigenous Peoples Resistance Day that is coming up on the 10th of October. So it's your national holiday that is coming up next week, Monday. These are some of the areas in which Belize is already looking at how to decolonize these historical narratives. The work of the Institute of Archaeology, who also have their International Archaeology Day event coming up on the 13th of October. And those are steps that then allow for that broader decolonization within the languages that are used in the archaeological record. And that is also occurring, again, through a lot of the public archaeology and community engaged projects, and we will have papers about that this afternoon as well. So like Becca said in the short answer, yes, but our field is constantly evolving and responding to societal needs, and so there are changes like the space that we're in right now that address that. I have a couple other questions. First, we have again from James. How threatened is the preservation of the graffiti room? And maybe you can speak, Kat, to preservation steps.
Thank you for that question. I think it's an excellent question. One of the concerns for this particular set of two rooms that are open right now is if we keep them open, is the graffiti in danger? Will it deteriorate? And that's one of the reasons why we are continually going back and doing RTI to see how much loss is happening on those particular walls. The other big question is what will happen if we backfill or when we backfill. Is that going to damage, cause some problems with preservation of this as well? And that, we know that there have been graffiti or Patoli boards in particular that have been excavated and then backfilled. And then when the area has been reopened, sometimes the preservation is not nearly as good as when it was originally excavated. So this is a challenge that we have to face, and that's why documentation is so key. You really have to photo document, you have to draw, you need to make sure everything is documented thoroughly in case there is a loss of preservation. And with that said, though, at Group C, the Xunantunich Archaeological Project had excavated one of those rooms with a patchouli board on the bench. And we did open up that excavation and expand it. And it was excavated in the 1990s and was backfilled. And the patchouli board was still there and in really good shape. So that gives me hope that when we need to backfill these particular rooms for stability purposes, that we will be able to backfill them in an intentional way to make sure that the graffiti is preserved the best that we possibly can. So, but thank you so much for that question. That's why documentation is key. We have to really emphasize that. And even, like the littlest elements, those are important. They were intentional symbols put on a wall by a Maya person back in the late Classic. And, today I just want to have that probably a young individual. I want that young individual's voice recorded so we keep it forever.
All right, thank you very much for that response. And I think in addition to sort of that preservation aspect, when we talk about, removing these neo-colonial elements from the way that we speak about past societies, we can also look at the way that we can create new avenues for access. And, acknowledging that archaeology is a destructive field. And so once you expose some of these elements, there is a certain level of damage that occurs that cannot be that you can mitigate for, but that does occur. And so that documentation access, but also using a lot of digital techniques and methodologies to, one, preserve as much as you can, but two, to create access, and looking at how agency can be incorporated in these methodologies for access. And so, if this is a heritage of all Belizeans, then all Belizeans can have access to this. So thank you very much for those interventions. And with that, unfortunately, I have to end our question and answer segment. So we had a very long and engaged question and answer segment in our previous session, and then a very short one this time around when there are a lot more questions. What I will ask of the presenters, if they can, could you answer in the Facebook or YouTube links the specific questions to you? So some of them were specific to the graffiti room and the excavations or the preservations, and others were to ceramic use in different spaces. Before I close off, I'd just like to say and highlight some of these comments that we also got. Excellent work and presentation, fascinating findings and methods, excellent work and presentation. Dr. Heather McKillop, thank you for joining us. But also these questions that we received from Botanical Boy and from James Bacon and Megan acknowledging, excellent questions around neocolonial sentiments. These are the types of discussions that we encourage and that need to occur within society. And so we're super, super happy that they are happening within the space of the KULCHA Symposium. And also acknowledging that one of the most important steps to breaking out of these mindsets is acknowledging that archaeology was created within those spaces, that some of those languages and techniques and mindsets still persist in some areas of archaeology, no matter how hard we try to distance the field from it, and that there is room for growth and room for improvement and the want to do better. And so with those mindsets, we continue the job of decolonizing both our fields and our mindsets. And with that, I say thank you very much to everybody for joining us here this morning for our first 2 sessions of the KULCHA Symposium. We will now break for lunch. There is a new stream. We will be back at 1 p.m. on our Facebook channels, on our Facebook page, on our YouTube channel. And we will continue the discussion with ethical archaeology, so looking at language use in archaeology, looking at different community engaged archaeology projects in Belize, in Western and Southern Belize, and then hearing from different perspectives on how heritage is engaged today, whether that is through cultural preservation, whether that is through ceramics and how that can be used to create connections to the past, or engage community archaeology initiatives. And so join us for more of these conversations on how we express and engage with our culture and heritage. Presenters, thank you so much for joining us. Audience, thank you so much for joining us. With that, we break for our afternoon or for our lunch, and we hope to see you for our afternoon session. Thank you very much.